In the sleepy village of St. Mary Mead, a tarnished knitting needle, buried in a dusty attic, unlocks a web of secrets that has festered for decades. When Miss Jane Marple uncovers a hidden sapphire and a locket inscribed forever, she unravels. A tale of forbidden love, betrayal, and a death that wasn't what it seemed. Was Colonel Dane's heart attack natural, or did a quiet maid's poison conceal a darker truth? As a mysterious stranger arrives with secrets of her own, a single question lingers. Who else knows what the needle hides in? What will they kill to keep it buried? Chapter 1. The quiet village. The village of St. Mary Mead lay nestled in a fold of the English countryside. Its thatched cottages and winding lanes bathed in the soft amber glow of an autumn afternoon. The air carried the faint scent of wood smoke and damp leaves, and the distant chime of the church clock marked the hour with a gentle insistence. Roses still clung to trellises, their petals fading but defiant, while the hedgerows brimmed with blackberries, tempting the children who darted through the lanes with sticky fingers and guilty grins. It was a place of serene predictability, where the rhythm of life seemed as unchanging as the seasons themselves. Yet, beneath this tranquil surface, currents of curiosity and gossip flowed as freely as the brook that wound past the vicarage.inn. Her modest cottage on the high street, Miss Jane Marple sat by the window of her drawing room, her knitting needles moving with the quiet precision of a metronome. The soft click of the needles was a counterpoint to the ticking of the mantel clock, and the scarf she was crafting a gift for her nephew Raymond grew steadily under her deft fingers. Her chair, upholstered in faded chintz, was positioned to catch the best light and afford a clear view of the village beyond her laced curtains. From this vantage point, Miss Marple observed the comings and goings of St. Mary Mead with an eye as keen as it was unassuming. She noticed the way Mrs. Price, the butcher's wife, lingered too long at the post office, her head tilted toward whispered confidences. She noted the hurried stride of young Tommy Pierce, who delivered the evening papers with a haste that suggested he was up to some mischief, and she saw, with particular interest, the postman's bicycle wobbling up the path to her gate, bearing a letter that was about to disrupt the villagers' calm. The letter was from Mrs. Elspeth Dane, a widow who lived in Greystone Hall, a rambling manor at the edge of St. Mary Mead. Elspeth was a woman of fragile nerves and fanciful imagination, prone to seeing omens in the ordinary. Her handwriting, spidery and uneven, betrayed her agitation as she described a peculiar discovery: a knitting needle, old and tarnished, found in the attic of her home. It was an odd thing to stir such unease, yet Elspeth's words were laced with a sense of foreboding, as though the needle were not merely an object, but a harbinger of something darker. "I know it sounds foolish, Jane," she wrote, "but I cannot shake the feeling that this needle does not belong here. It is as if it carries a secret I am not meant to know." She begged Miss Marple to visit, to lend her quiet wisdom to the matter. Miss Marple folded the letter and placed it on the table beside her teacup, her mind already turning over the possibilities. A knitting needle was a commonplace thing, yet its presence in Elspeth's attic was undeniably curious. Elspeth was not a knitter. Her hands trembled too much for such delicate work, and her late husband, Colonel Dane, had been a man of military habits, unlikely to dabble in domestic crafts. The needle, then, must have belonged to someone else. Someone whose story had been forgotten in the dust of Greystone Hall's attic. Miss Marple's eyes, bright and bird-like, gleamed with interest. She had a knack for uncovering the threads of human nature for seeing the patterns that others missed. In St. Mary Mead, where secrets were as common as tea and scones, she knew that even the smallest detail could unravel a mystery. She rose from her chair, smoothing her skirt with a practiced gesture, and prepared to call on Elspeth. The walk to Greystone Hall was not long, but it would give her time to reflect. She slipped on her coat, a sensible woolen one that had seen many seasons, and selected a hat from the rack, a modest affair with a single feather, chosen more for propriety than vanity. As she stepped into the crisp air, she paused to exchange pleasantries with Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, who was pruning her dahlias with a vigour that suggested she was working off some private irritation. "A fine day, isn't it, Miss Marple?" Mrs. Clement called, her voice bright, but her eyes wary. "Indeed it is," Miss Marple replied, her smile as gentle as ever, "though I dare say the evenings are growing chill. One must be careful not to catch cold." She moved on before Mrs. Clement could launch into one of her lengthy monologues about the parish council or the shortcomings of the choir. Miss Marple had a destination, and her mind was already occupied with the puzzle of the knitting needle. The path to Greystone Hall wound past the village green, where a group of boys were kicking a ball with more enthusiasm than skill, and through a copse of beech trees whose leaves glowed golden in the fading light. The manor itself stood at the end of a gravel drive, its stone facades softened by ivy that climbed like a living curtain. It was a handsome house, but it bore the marks of neglect. A cracked window pane here, a sagging gutter there. The Danes had never been wealthy, and since the Colonel's death 5 years ago, Elspeth had struggled to maintain the place. Her staff was smaller cook, Mrs. Baxter, who ruled the kitchen with a tyrant's zeal, a maid, Clara, whose quiet demeanour hid a sharp intelligence, and Tom, the gardener, a man of few words but many secrets, or so Miss Marple suspected. Elspeth greeted her at the door, her thin frame swathed in a shawl that seemed too heavy for her. Her eyes, wide and anxious, darted to the shadows of the hall as though expecting some unseen threat. "Oh, Jane, I'm so glad you've come," she said, her voice trembling. "It's such a small thing, this needle, but it's upset me dreadfully. Come, I'll show you." She led Miss Marple through the house, past portraits of stern-faced Danes and a grandfather Reloge, whose pendulum swung with a mournful creak. The air was heavy with the scent of lavender and old wood, and the floorboards groaned underfoot. They climbed a narrow staircase to the attic, where the light was dim and the air thick with dust. The needle lay on a small table, displayed as though it were a museum piece. It was longer than most knitting needles, its metal dulled by time, its tip slightly bent as though it had been used for something other than stitching yarn. Miss Marple examined it closely, her fingers tracing its surface. "Where exactly did you find it?" she asked. "In the corner, near a trunk," Elspeth replied, pointing to a pile of crates and boxes that cluttered the attic. "Clara was cleaning up. There she's been sorting through things. You know, trying to make the place tidier, and she came across it. I asked her if it was hers, but she said no, and Mrs. Baxter swears she's never seen it before. Tom just grunted when I asked him, but that's Tom for you." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes scanning the attic. The space was a jumble of forgotten things, a broken chair, a cracked mirror, a stack of yellowed newspapers. The trunk Elspeth mentioned was old, its leather cracked and its brass fittings tarnished. It bore no lock, but its lid was heavy, and Miss Marple suspected it had not been opened in years. "May I look inside?" she asked. "Of course," Elspeth said, though her voice wavered. Clara was summoned to help, and the maid appeared, her face pale and her hands clasped tightly before her. She lifted the lid with effort, revealing a collection of faded dresses, a few books, and a small wooden box. Miss Marple's attention was drawn to the box, which was carved with intricate flowers and bore the initials L. She did not open it not yet, but she noted its presence, as well as Clara's quick glance toward it. "There's nothing of value here," Elspeth said, her hands fluttering. "Just old things from the previous owners, I suppose. We never bothered to clear it out when we bought the house." Miss Marple smiled, her expression as serene as a summer pond. "Old things often have stories to tell," she said. "I should like to know more about this needle. It's not the sort one finds every day." She did not mention the initials or the box, but her mind was already weaving connections. LM could be anyone, but in a village like St. Mary Mead, names had a way of resurfacing. Carried on the tide of memory and gossip, they descended to the drawing room, where Mrs. Baxter served tea with a brusqueness that bordered on rudeness. The scones were overbaked, and the tea was too strong, but Miss Marple sipped it politely, her eyes never leaving Elspeth's face. "Tell me," she said, "has anything else unusual happened recently? Anything out of the ordinary?" Elspeth hesitated, her fingers twisting the fringe of her shawl. "Well, there was that odd noise in the night, a week or so ago, like something being dragged across the floor, up in the attic. I thought it was mice, but Clara said she checked and found nothing. And then there's Tom, he's been acting strangely, more sullen than usual. I caught him staring at the house the other day, as if he were looking for something." Miss Marple nodded, filing away these details. She knew that in a house like Greystone Hall, noises and sullen gardeners were not uncommon, but they could also be the loose threads of a larger tapestry. She finished her tea and rose to leave, promising to return the next day. As she walked back to the village, the sun dipping below the horizon, she turned her thoughts to the history of Greystone Hall. The house had been built in the 18th century, passing through many hands before the Danes bought it 20 years ago. Colonel Dane had been a man of some repute, a decorated officer with a fondness for cards and brandy. His death, sudden and attributed to a heart attack, had caused a stir at the time. There had been rumours of debts, of quarrels, of a woman seen leaving the house the night before he died. Miss Marple had paid little attention then, but now, with the discovery of the needle, those rumours took on a new significance. Back in her cottage, she settled by the fire, her knitting resumed. The needles moved steadily, their rhythm a counterpoint to her thoughts. She recalled a conversation with Miss Hartnell, the village busybody, who had once mentioned a governess who lived at Greystone Hall long ago, a woman named Lillian, or perhaps Lydia, who had left under a cloud. The details were vague, but Miss Marple knew where to look. The parish records, kept meticulously by the vicar, might hold a clue, as might the memories of older villagers like Mrs. Bantry, whose tongue was as sharp as her wit. The evening deepened, and the village grew quiet, save for the occasional bark of a dog or the rustle of leaves in the wind. Miss Marple's cottage was a haven of warmth and order, its shelves lined with books and its walls adorned with watercolours painted by her late father. Yet her mind was far from peaceful. The knitting needle, with its bent tip and tarnished surface, was an anomaly, a piece that did not fit the pattern of Greystone Hall's present. She thought of Elspeth's nervous hands, Clara's pale face, Tom's sullen silence. Each was a thread, and she was determined to follow them to their source. As she worked, her thoughts drifted to her own past, to the countless small mysteries she had unravelled in St. Mary Mead and beyond. She had learned, over the years, that human nature was as predictable as it was complex. People lied, hid, coveted, loved often in ways that seemed incomprehensible until the right question was asked. The needle was a question, and Miss Marple intended to find its answer. She set her knitting aside and reached for her notebook, a small leather-bound volume where she jotted down her observations. She wrote, "Knitting needle, found in attic, not Elspeth's, nor Staff's, initials. Elm on trunk. Possible connection to old scandal at Greystone Hall. Colonel Dane's death, heart attack or otherwise. Investigate parish records. Speak to Mrs. Bantry." She closed the notebook and leaned back, her eyes half closed, but her mind alert. The fire crackled, casting shadows that danced like secrets across the walls. The next morning, she would visit the vicarage and begin her inquiries. But for now, she allowed herself a moment of stillness, her thoughts as intricate as the lace she so admired. St. Mary Mead might appear a quiet village, but Miss Marple knew better. Beneath its surface, stories waited to be told, and she was ready to listen. The clock struck 9, and Miss Marple rose to prepare for bed. As she turned down the lamp, she glanced at the window, where the moonlight silvered the garden. Somewhere, out there in the quiet of the night, the truth about the knitting needle lay hidden, and Miss Marple, with her unerring instinct for the truth, was determined to find it. Chapter 2. Greystone Hall. The morning sun cast long shadows across St. Mary Mead as Miss Jane Marple set out for Greystone Hall, her steps measured but purposeful. The air was crisp, with a hint of frost lingering in the hollows, and the village was stirring into life. The baker's boy whistled as he stacked loaves in his basket, and Mrs. Weatherby, the postmistress, was already sweeping her doorstep with a vigour that suggested she was eager for the day's gossip. Miss Marple, her black handbag tucked under her arm, nodded politely to passers-by, her serene smile giving no hint of the curiosity that burned within her. The knitting needle, that strange relic unearthed in Elspeth Dane's attic, had set her mind alight, and she was determined to unravel its significance. Greystone Hall stood at the far end of the village, its silhouette softened by a veil of mist that clung to the surrounding fields. The house was a study in faded grandeur, its grey stone walls etched with the passage of time. Ivy curled around the chimneys, and the windows, though clean, seemed to watch the world with a weary resignation. As Miss Marple approached, she noted the uneven gravel of the drive, the untamed rose bushes, and the faint creak of a gate left ajar. These were small things, but to Miss Marple, they spoke of a household stretched thin, its resources and spirits worn by years of quiet struggle. Mrs. Elspeth Dane met her at the door, her face pale and her hands clasped tightly as though to steady herself. "Jane, you're so kind to come again," she said, her voice a fragile thread. "I haven't slept a wink since that wretched needle turned up. It's foolish, I know, but it feels like an ill omen." Her eyes darted toward the staircase, as though expecting the attic itself to descend upon them. "Nonsense, Elspeth," Miss Marple said gently, stepping into the hall. "It's only a needle, after all, but I should like to see where it was found. Sometimes the smallest things lead to the most interesting discoveries." Her tone was reassuring, but her eyes were sharp, taking in the faded tapestries, the scuffed floorboards, and the faint smell of damp that lingered beneath the polish. Elspeth led her up the main staircase, her steps hesitant, as though she feared what lay above. The house was silent, save for the distant clatter of pots from the kitchen. where Mrs. Baxter was no doubt preparing luncheon with her usual ferocity. Clara, the maid, appeared briefly at the foot of the stairs, a duster in hand, but she vanished into a side room before Miss Marple could speak to her. Tom, the gardener, was nowhere to be seen, though Miss Marple glimpsed his wheelbarrow through a window, abandoned beside a row of wilting cabbages. The attic stairs were narrow and steep. They were worn smooth by decades of use. A chill hung in the air as they climbed, and the light grew dim, filtered through a single dusty skylight. The attic itself was a cavern of shadows, its sloping ceiling crisscrossed with beams that seemed to have grown under the weight of memory. Trunks and crates were piled haphazardly, their surfaces coated in dust that swirled like ghosts in the faint light. Old furniture, cracked mirror, a chair with a missing leg stood like sentinels of neglect, and a pile of moth-eaten curtains lay in a heap near the far wall. There, Elspeth said, pointing to a corner where a heavy trunk stood apart from the rest. Clara found the needle there, just beside it. I haven't touched it since. The needle lay on a small table, its tarnished surface catching the light with a dull gleam. It was an unremarkable thing at first glance, yet its presence in this forgotten place was jarring, like a single wrong note in a familiar tune. Miss Marple picked it up, turning it over in her hands. The metal was cool, its tip bent slightly, as though it had been pressed against something unyielding. She noted its weight, heavier than modern needles, and the faint scratches along its length, suggesting years of use or misuse. "Tell me, Elspeth," she said, her voice calm but probing, "has anyone else been in the attic recently? Visitors, perhaps, or tradesmen?" Elspeth shook her head, her shawl slipping slightly. "No one, Jane. Just Clara, and she only went up to tidy. The attic's been locked for years. My husband never liked anyone poking about up here. He said it was full of junk, not worth bothering with." Her words trailed off, and Miss Marple noted the flicker of unease in her eyes. Colonel Dane, she recalled, had been a man of secrets, his bluff exterior masking a life of private dealings. His death, though certified as natural, had left questions that lingered like the dust in this attic. Miss Marple approached the trunk, its leather surface cracked and its brass fittings green with age. The initials LM were etched into the lid, faint but unmistakable. She ran her fingers over them, her mind already sifting through possibilities. "And this trunk," she said, "you've no idea who it belonged to?" "None," Elspeth replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was here when we bought the house. I always meant to clear it out, but there was never time. And after George died, I couldn't bear to come up here. It's so ... oppressive." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of gentle sympathy, though her thoughts were far from gentle. She lifted the lid, which creaked in protest, revealing a collection of items that seemed to belong to another era. There were dresses, silk faded to a ghostly sheen, a pair of kid gloves, brittle with age, and a small wooden box, its surface carved with a pattern of roses. Inside the box, she found a locket, its silver tarnished but intact, and a bundle of letters tied with a frayed ribbon. The letters were addressed to Miss Lillian Marsh, a name that stirred a faint memory in Miss Marple's mind. She did not open them, not yet, but she noted the careful script. The ink faded, but legible. "Lillian Marsh," she murmured, as though testing the name. "Does it mean anything to you, Elspeth?" Elspeth frowned, her hands twisting together. "I don't think so. Perhaps she was a tenant, or a servant, from before our time. The house has had so many owners." Her voice wavered, and Miss Marple sensed there was more she was not saying. But she did not press, knowing that Elspeth's nerves were as fragile as the lace on her cuffs. Instead, she turned her attention to the attic itself, her eyes scanning the floor, the walls, the beams. She noticed a faint scuff mark near the trunk, as though something heavy had been dragged across the boards. The dust was disturbed in places, suggesting recent movement, though Elspeth swore no one had been up here but Clara. Miss Marple knelt, her knees protesting, and examined the floor more closely. There was a loose board, its edges slightly raised, and she made a mental note to return to it later, when she could investigate without Elspeth's anxious presence. They descended to the drawing room, where Mrs. Baxter had laid out a tray of tea and biscuits. The biscuits were hard, and the tea was lukewarm, but Miss Marple sipped it politely, her mind elsewhere. She asked Elspeth about the household, drawing out small details with the ease of a fisherman casting a net. Clara, it seemed, was a local girl, quiet but efficient, who had worked at Greystone Hall for 3 years. Mrs. Baxter had been with the family longer, her loyalty tempered by a sharp tongue and a fondness for gin. Tom, the gardener, was a man of few words, his past a mystery even to Elspeth. He came with the house, almost, she said with a weak laugh. George hired him years ago, and he stayed ever since. Miss Marple listened, her needles clicking softly in her lap. She had brought her knitting, as she often did, to keep her hands busy while her mind worked. She asked about Colonel Dane, probing gently into his habits, his friends, his enemies. Elspeth spoke fondly of her husband, but there was a brittleness to her words, as though she were reciting a script. He was a good man, she said, but he had his troubles. Debts, you know, from his time in India, and he could be stern at times. Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of quiet understanding. She knew that men like Colonel Dane often carried burdens that their wives only half understood. She thought of the rumors that had swirled after his death, whispers of a woman seen leaving the house, of arguments overheard in the night. She made a note to speak to Mrs. Bantry, whose memory for village scandals was as sharp as her tongue, as she prepared to leave. Miss Marple caught sight of Clara in the hall, polishing a silver candlestick with a vigor that seemed almost desperate. The girl's eyes met hers for a moment, then dropped, and Miss Marple noted the flush that crept up her cheeks. There was something there, she thought, something Clara was not saying. She thanked Elspeth for her hospitality and stepped out into the cool air, her mind alive with questions. The walk back to the village was brisk, the mist having lifted to reveal a sky of pale blue. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Lillian Marsh, the name on the letters. She recalled a fragment of gossip from years ago, something about a governess who had left St. Mary Mead under mysterious circumstances. The details were vague, but Miss Marple knew where to look. The vicarage, with its meticulous records, would be her next stop, and Mrs. Bantry's tea table would yield its own harvest of memories. As she passed the village green, she saw Tom pushing his wheelbarrow, his shoulders hunched as though carrying a weight heavier than earth. She raised a hand in greeting, but he merely nodded, his eyes avoiding hers. Miss Marple smiled to herself. People, she knew, were like skeins of wool tangled and knotted until you found the right thread to pull, and she was very good at pulling threads. Back in her cottage, she settled by the fire, her knitting resumed. The scarf for Raymond grew longer, its stitches neat and even, but her mind was far from the wool in her hands. She thought of the needle, the trunk, the letters, the scuff marks. In the attic, each was a piece of a puzzle, and Miss Marple was determined to fit them together. She opened her notebook and wrote, "Lillian Marsh, governess, possibly connected to Greystone Hall. Initials on trunk. Scuff marks suggest recent activity. Clara's unease, guilt, or fear. Tom's silence hiding something. Investigate Colonel Dane's death further." She closed the notebook and leaned back, her eyes half closed, but her mind as sharp as the needle that had started it all. The village of St. Mary Mead might be quiet, but Miss Marple knew that quiet places often held the deepest secrets, and she was ready to uncover them. Chapter 3. The village whispers. The morning mist had burned away, leaving St. Mary Mead bathed in a crisp autumn light that sharpened the outlines of its cottages and gilded the leaves still clinging to the trees. Miss Jane Marple walked briskly along the high street, her black handbag swinging gently at her side, her eyes taking in the village's familiar rhythm. The greengrocer was arranging apples in a pyramid, their red skins gleaming like jewels, while Mrs. Price, the butcher's wife, lingered at the post office door, her conversation with Miss Hartnell punctuated by sharp nods and knowing glances. To an outsider, it was a scene of pastoral calm, but Miss Marple knew better. St. Mary Mead was a tapestry of secrets, its threads woven through every glance, every whispered word, every pause that spoke louder than speech. The knitting needle, that curious relic from Greystone Hall's attic, had already begun to stir the village's gossip. By the time Miss Marple reached the post office, the news had spread, carried on the swift wings of curiosity. Miss Hartnell, her face flushed with the thrill of a new scandal, was holding court behind the counter, her voice carrying over the clink of coins and the rustle of envelopes. A knitting needle, of all things, she declared to Mrs. Weatherby, who was buying stamps with an air of studied indifference. Found in Elspeth Dane's attic, and no one knows where it came from. Mark my words, there's something queer about it. I wouldn't be surprised if it's tied to that business with Colonel Dane's death all those years ago. Miss Marple, pausing to examine a display of postcards, listened without seeming to. She knew Miss Hartnell's penchant for exaggeration, but she also knew that gossip, like a river, often carried nuggets of truth amid its silt. She approached the counter, her smile as mild as milk, and purchased a single stamp, lingering just long enough to catch Miss Hartnell's eye. "Good morning, Miss Hartnell," she said. "I hear there's been quite a stir at Greystone Hall. A knitting needle, you say?" Miss Hartnell's eyes gleamed. "Indeed, Miss Marple. Elspeth found it in her attic, or so Clara says. A nasty old thing, all bent and tarnished. I told Mrs. Weatherby here, it's not natural, finding something like that in a house where no one knits. And you know what they said about Colonel Dane died in his sleep, they claimed. But there were rumors, oh yes. A woman seen leaving the house, and debts piling up like nobody's business." She lowered her voice, though the post office was empty, save for Mrs. Weatherby, who leaned in eagerly. "I always thought there was more to it than a heart attack." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of polite interest. "Rumors do have a way of lingering," she said, "though I dare say most are just idle talk. Still, it's curious about the needle. I wonder if anyone in the village might recall who lived at Greystone Hall before the Danes. Old houses do keep their secrets, don't they?" Miss Hartnell puffed up, delighted to be consulted. "Well, there was old Mrs. Haverford, of course, before the Danes bought the place. A queer sort, kept to herself. And before her, I believe it was the Marsh family, or was it Morton? No, Marsh, I'm sure of it. There was a governess, too, who caused a bit of a stir, left suddenly, and no one knew why. You'd have to ask Mrs. Bantry. She'd remember better than I." Miss Marple thanked her and stepped out into the street, her mind sifting through the fragments of information. The name Marsh, coupled with the initials L.M. on the attic trunk, was no coincidence, she was certain. She made a mental note to visit Mrs. Bantry, whose memory for village scandals was as sharp as a tailor's shears. But first, she had another stop to make. The shop of Mr. Pye, the antique dealer, whose knowledge of old objects might shed light on the needle itself. Mr. Pye's shop was a treasure trove of curiosities, its windows crowded with porcelain figurines, tarnished, silver, and faded paintings. The bell above the door jingled as Miss Marple entered, and Mr. Pye emerged from the back, his thin face alight with a smile that was equal parts charm and calculation. "Miss Marple, a pleasure, as always. Have you come to browse, or is there something particular on your mind?" His voice was smooth, but his eyes were sharp. "Missing nothing? I've come about a knitting needle," Miss Marple said, her tone light. "One found at Greystone Hall, quite old and rather unusual. I wondered if you might have seen anything like it, Mr. Pye. You're so knowledgeable about such things." Mr. Pye's eyebrows rose, and he adjusted his spectacles, intrigued. "A knitting needle, you say? From Greystone Hall? Most curious. I don't often deal in such humble items, but I'd be happy to take a look. Was it silver, perhaps, or bone? Some Victorian needles were quite finely made, you know, almost like jewellery." Miss Marple described the needle, its length, its tarnished metal, its bent tip. Mr. Pye frowned, tapping his chin. "Not silver then, but perhaps steel, from an earlier time. The bent tip is odd, suggests it was used for something other than knitting. Prying open a lock, maybe, or digging into something hard. I'd need to see it to be sure, but it sounds like it could be from the late 19th century. Did Mrs. Dane say where it was found?" "In the attic," Miss Marple replied, watching his reaction closely. "Near a trunk with the initials L.M. Does that bring anything to mind?" Mr. Pye's smile faltered, just for a moment, before he recovered. "L.M. can't say it does. Greystone Halls had so many owners, you know, and attics do collect the oddest things. But I'll keep an ear out, Miss Marple. If I hear of anything, I'll let you know." His tone was cheerful, but Miss Marple noted the slight tightening of his hands, the way his eyes flicked toward a ledger on the counter. She thanked him and left, her mind buzzing. Mr. Pye knew more than he was saying. She was sure of it. His shop was a hub for village secrets, not just antiques. And she suspected he had heard whispers about the needle, or perhaps the trunk's owner, that he was not yet ready to share. She would return to him later, when she had more to press him with. Her next stop was the vicarage, where the parish records might confirm the identity of Lillian Marsh. The vicar, Mr. Clement, was in his study, surrounded by books and papers, his face as kindly as it was distracted. His wife, Griselda, offered tea with a warmth that was genuine but tinged with impatience, was young, and the slow pace of village life often chafed her. Miss Marple declined the tea, citing a need to return home before dark, and asked to see the records from the early 1900s. Mr. Clement, ever obliging, pulled a heavy ledger from a shelf and turned to the relevant pages. There, in neat script, was an entry for Lillian Marsh, employed as a governess at Greystone Hall from 1903 to 1905. She had been 22, unmarried, and had left the village abruptly in the autumn of 1905, with no forwarding address. There was also a note about a burglary at the hall that same year. Sapphire brooch, a family heirloom, had been stolen, and suspicion had fallen on a servant, though no one was ever charged. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the entry, her mind weaving connections. A governess, a stolen brooch, a sudden departure, and now, decades later, a knitting needle found near a trunk marked with her initials. It was a pattern, and Miss Marple was adept at reading patterns. As she walked home, the village settling into the quiet of late afternoon, she passed the Blue Boar, where a group of men were gathered outside, their voices low but animated. She caught a snippet of their conversations, something about Tom, the gardener, and a quarrel he'd had with a stranger in the pub the previous week. Miss Marple filed this away, her thoughts turning to Tom's sullen demeanor, his reluctance to meet her eyes. He had worked at Greystone Hall for years, long enough to know its secret saw to keep them back in her cottage. Miss Marple settled by the fire, her knitting needles resuming their steady rhythm. The scarf for Raymond was nearly finished, its soft wool a comfort in her hands. She opened her notebook and added to her earlier notes, Lillian Marsh, governess, left 1905 after burglary at Greystone Hall. Sapphire brooch, stolen, no culprit. Found, Mr. Pye evasive knows more. Tom involved in recent quarrel. Check with Mrs. Bantry, Marsh scandal. She closed the notebook and leaned back, her eyes fixed on the flames. The knitting needle was more than a curiosity now, it was a key unlocking a door to the past. Miss Marple knew that St. Mary Mead, for all its sleepy charm, was a place where secrets never stayed buried for long. She would visit Mrs. Bantry tomorrow, and perhaps Tom, too, if she could catch him unawares. For now, she let the fire's warmth seep into her bones, her mind as sharp as the needle that had set this mystery in motion. Chapter 4. The attic's secrets. The morning broke with a pale, watery light that filtered through the clouds, casting St. Mary Mead in a soft, almost mournful glow. Miss Jane Marple, fortified by a cup of tea and a slice of toast with marmalade, set out early for Greystone Hall, her mind as sharp as the chill in the air. The village was still waking, its lanes quiet save for the clatter of milk bottles and the distant crow of a rooster. Her black handbag, a faithful companion, swung lightly at her side, and her hat, a neat felt one with a single ribbon, was pinned firmly in place. The knitting needle, that enigmatic relic from Elspeth Dane's attic, had taken root in her thoughts, and she was determined to examine its resting place more closely. There were threads to be followed, and Miss Marple had a knack for finding where they led. Greystone Hall loomed at the end of the gravel drive, its stone facade softened by a thin veil of mist. The house seemed to crouch under the weight of its own history, its windows like eyes that had seen too much. Miss Marple paused at the gate, noting the overgrown hedges and the faint tire marks in the gravel. Fresh, she thought, and not from a cart or bicycle. Someone had been here recently, perhaps in a motor car, though Elspeth had mentioned no visitors. She filed this observation away, her mind already turning to the attic and its secrets. Elspeth greeted her at the door, her face drawn and her hands fluttering like moths. "Jane, you're a saint to come again," she said, her voice brittle with nerves. "I've been thinking about that needle all night. It's silly, I know, but it feels as though it's watching me." She gave a nervous laugh, then led Miss Marple inside, her shawl trailing behind her like a shadow. The hall was dim, the air heavy with the scent of beeswax and old wood. From the kitchen came the sharp clang of a pan, followed by Mrs. Back, voice raised in irritation, likely scolding Clara for some minor infraction. Miss Marple's eyes flicked to the staircase, where Clara appeared briefly, her apron smudged and her expression guarded. "Shall I come with you, ma'am?" the maid asked, her voice low. "Yes, Clara, please," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle but firm. "I'd like to see exactly where you found the needle." Clara nodded, her hands twisting in her apron, and led the way up the narrow attic stairs. Elspeth followed, her steps hesitant, as though the attic were a place of dread rather than mere clutter. The attic was, as Miss Marple remembered it, a cavern of dust and shadows, its air thick with the musty scent of forgotten things. The skylight cast a feeble glow, illuminating cobwebs that draped the beams like lace. Trunks and crates stood in haphazard piles, their surfaces marked by time, and a broken spinning wheel leaned against one wall, its spokes sagging like the ribs of some ancient creature. The table where the needle rested was unchanged, its tarnished occupant lying alone, its bent tip catching the light with a faint, accusing gleam. Miss Marple approached the corner where the needle had been found, her eyes scanning the floor. The trunk with the initials LME stood as before, its leather cracked and its brass fittings dulled by age. She knelt, ignoring the protest of her knees, and examined the spot where Clara had pointed. The dust was disturbed here, not just by Clara's cleaning, but by something heavier, faint drag mark, barely visible, suggested the trunk had been moved, perhaps recently. She ran her fingers along the floorboards, feeling for irregularities, and found the loose board she had noticed before. It lifted slightly under her touch, revealing a narrow gap beneath. But she did not pry further, not with Elspeth and Clara watching. "Clara," Miss Marple said, rising and brushing dust from her skirt, "can you tell me exactly how you found the needle? Were you moving the trunk, or was it lying in plain sight?" Clara's eyes flickered, and she hesitated before answering. "It was just there, ma'am, on the floor by the trunk. I was sweeping, and I saw it glint in the light. I didn't move anything, I swear." Her voice was steady, but her hands betrayed her, clutching the edge of her apron as though it were a lifeline. Miss Marple nodded, her smile reassuring. "Of course, Clara. It's easy to miss things in a place like this." She turned to the trunk, lifting its lid with care. The contents were as she had seen them: faded dresses, a pair of brittle gloves, and the small wooden box with its carved roses. She opened the box, revealing the silver locket and the bundle of letters tied with ribbon. The letters, addressed to Lillian Marsh, were written in a hurried, almost desperate hand, their ink faded but legible. She slipped one letter into her handbag, promising Elspeth to return it after a closer look. "These may tell us something about the trunk's owner," she said, her tone light but her mind alert. Elspeth wrung her hands. "I don't like it, Jane. All these old things, stirring up the past. I wish we'd never found that needle." Her voice trembled, and Miss Marple patted her arm gently, though her thoughts were elsewhere. The attic felt alive with secrets, its shadows hiding more than dust and cobwebs. As they descended, Miss Marple glanced back at Clara, who lingered by the attic door, her face pale. "Clara," she said softly, "if you remember anything else about the attic, anything at all, you'll tell me, won't you?" The maid nodded, but her eyes slid away, and Miss Marple noted the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers tightened on the doorframe in the drawing room. Mrs. Baxter served tea with her usual brusqueness, the cups rattling as she set them down. The biscuits were stale, but Miss Marple nibbled one politely, her eyes on Elspeth. "Tell me," she said, "has the attic always been locked?" You mentioned your husband didn't like anyone going up there. Elspeth nodded, her shawl slipping again. George was particular about it. He said it was full of rubbish, not worth bothering with, but he kept the key in his study. After he died, I left it locked in till Clara started tidying, of course. She paused, her eyes distant. He was always so private, George, even with me. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind turning over the Colonel's secrecy. A man like Colonel Dane, with his military bearing and hidden debts, might have had reasons to keep the attic off limits. She thought of the rumors surrounding his death, the woman seen leaving the house, the whispers of financial ruin, the needle, the trunk, the letters. They were pieces of a puzzle, and she was beginning to see its shape as she prepared to leave. She caught sight of Tom outside, raking leaves with a slow, deliberate motion. His face was shadowed by his cap, but she sensed his awareness of her presence, the way his shoulders stiffened as she passed. "Good morning, Tom," she called, her voice cheerful. He grunted in reply, his eyes fixed on the ground, and Miss Marple smiled to herself. Tom, she thought, was a man with secrets, and she would find a way to draw them out. The walk back to the village was brisk, the air sharp with the promise of winter. Miss Marple's thoughts were a tangle of threads. Needle, Lillian Marsh, the Colonel's death, Clara's unease, Tom's silence. She stopped by the churchyard, where the gravestones leaned like old men sharing secrets. There, among the mossy stones, she found a marker for a Mary Marsh, died 1890, perhaps a relative of Lillian's. It was a small clue, but Miss Marple knew that small clues often led to great revelations. Back in her cottage, she settled by the fire, her knitting needles clicking as she resumed work on Raymond's scarf. She opened the letter from the attic, its paper brittle under her fingers. It was dated September 1905, written in a man's hand, and spoke of a clandestine meeting at Greystone Hall. "I must see you," it read, "before all is lost. Meet me at midnight, by the oak." The signature was a scrawl, unreadable, but the tone was urgent, almost pleading. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. A lover's note, perhaps, or something more sinister. She thought of the burglary in 1905, the stolen sapphire brooch, Lillian's sudden departure. Had she been involved, or a victim? She opened her notebook and wrote, "Letter from 1905, likely to Lillian Marsh, suggests secret meeting, burglary. At Greystone Hall, same year connection. Clara nervous, possibly hiding something. Tom evasive. Gravestone of Mary Marsh, possible relative. Speak to Mrs. Bantry about Lillian's scandal." She closed the notebook, her mind alive with possibilities. The fire crackled, casting shadows that danced across the walls. Miss Marple leaned back, her knitting needle still, her eyes fixed on the flames. The attic of Greystone Hall held more than dust and relics. It held a story, and she was determined to read it to its end. Chapter 5. The shadow of Lillian Marsh. The afternoon sun hung low over St. Mary Mead, its light filtering through a haze of clouds that promised rain by evening. Miss Jane Marple sat in her cottage, the letter from Greystone Hall's attic spread before her on the polished table. The paper was fragile, its edges curling like petals, and the ink had faded to a ghostly brown. But the words still carried a weight of urgency, a plea for a midnight meeting, a hint of desperation, a signature too scrawled to decipher. Miss Marple's knitting lay idle in her lap, the needles silent for once, as her mind wove through the threads of the mystery. The knitting needle, the trunk marked LME, The name Lillian Marsh. These were not mere relics of the past, but markers of a story that refused to stay buried. She rose, smoothing her skirt with a practiced gesture, and reached for her coat and hat. The vicarage records had confirmed Lillian Marsh's existence. Her governess at Greystone Hall departed suddenly in 1905 after a burglary that left a sapphire brooch missing. But records were cold facts, and Miss Marple sought the warmer pulse of village memory. Mrs. Dolly Bantry, her old friend, was the keeper of St. Mary Mead's unwritten history, her sharp tongue and sharper recall unmatched in ferreting out the scandals of yesteryear. If anyone could shed light on Lillian Marsh, it was Dolly. The walk to Bantry Lodge was brisk, the air sharp with the scent of wet earth and woods. The lodge, a sprawling house of red brick and gabled roofs, stood at the edge of the village, its gardens a riot of late chrysanthemums. Mrs. Bantry was in the drawing room, surrounded by cushions and a clutter of novels, her face lighting up at the sight of Miss Marple. "Jane, you old sleuth," she exclaimed, waving away a hovering maid with a tray of tea things. "You've got that look in your eye. Something's afoot, isn't it? Sit down and tell me everything." Miss Marple settled into a chintz-covered chair, her handbag resting primly on her knees. "It's a small matter, Dolly, but a curious one," she said, her voice soft but deliberate. A knitting needle was found in the attic at Greystone Hall, near a trunk marked with the initials LM, the parish records. Mention a Lillian Marsh, a governess there in 1905. "I thought you might remember something about her." Mrs. Bantry's eyes gleamed, and she leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Lillian Marsh. Oh, Jane, that takes me back. She was quite the talk of the village, you know, though I was just a girl then, a pretty thing. All dark curls and big eyes, but far too spirited for a governess. Worked for the Haverfords at Greystone Hall, stuffy lot. There was a scandal, of course. There always is with girls like that." She paused, savoring the memory, then continued. "They said she was sweet on some man, someone unsuitably tradesman, maybe, or a soldier. Nobody knew for sure. Then there was that burglary, the sapphire brooch, a Haverford heirloom, gone without a trace. Everyone whispered Lillian had something to do with it, though nothing was proved. She left the village right after, and that was that." Miss Marple nodded, her fingers tracing the edge of her handbag. "Did anyone say what became of her, or who the man might have been?" Mrs. Bantry frowned, tapping her chin. "Not that I recall. There were rumors she'd run off with him, or that she'd gone to London to start over. Some said she was heartbroken, others that she was cunning as a fox. You know how people talk half-truth, half-fancy. But I do remember my aunt saying Lillian was seen crying by the churchyard the night before she left. Something about a locket she always wore, like she was clutching it for dear life." The locket, Miss Marple thought, picturing the tarnished silver piece from the attic's wooden box. "And the burglary?" she asked. "Was there ever a suspect besides Lillian?" "Not officially," Mrs. Bantry said, reaching for a biscuit and crumbling it absently. "The Haverfords were tight-lipped, didn't want the scandal. But there was talk of a stranger in the village around that time, a man, rough-looking, seen near Greystone Hall. And then there was the butler, old Mr. Grayson. He was sacked, not long after, though nobody said why. I always thought he knew more than he let on." Miss Marple filed these details away, her mind as precise as a ledger. A governess, a lover, a burglary, a locket. A dismissed butler, each was a thread, and she was beginning to see how they might weave together. She thanked Mrs. Bantry, promising to return for a longer chat, and stepped out into the gathering. Dusk. The village was quiet now, the lights in the cottages glowing like beacons against the grey sky. As she passed the Blue Boar, she overheard two men discussing the weather, their voices tinged with the unease that comes before a storm. She thought of Clara's pale face, Tom's sullen silence, and the scuff marks in the attic. Something had stirred at Greystone Hall, and the needle was only the beginning. Back in her cottage, Miss Marple lit the lamps and settled by the fire, the letter from the attic in her hands. She read it again, her eyes lingering on the words, "I must see you before all is lost." The desperation was palpable, and she wondered if Lillian had been fleeing from danger or toward it. The mention of the oak in the letter tugged at her memory. There was an ancient oak near Greystone Hall, its gnarled branches a landmark for the village children. Had it been a meeting place, a trysting spot, or something more sinister? She turned to the locket which she had borrowed from Elspeth, with a vague promise to have it cleaned. It was heavier than it looked, its silver etched with a delicate pattern of vines. She opened it carefully, revealing a tiny photograph of a young woman with striking features, dark hair, wide eyes, a hint of defiance in her expression. Miss Marple felt certain this was Lillian Marsh. On the back of the photograph was a single word, etched in a fine hand: forever. It was a lover's word, but it carried a weight of loss, of promises, unkept. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was young Tommy Pierce, the paper boy, his cap askew and his cheeks flushed from the cold. "Evening, Miss Marple," he said, thrusting a newspaper into her hands. "Heard you was asking about Greystone Hall. My gran says there's ghosts up there on account of that governess what disappeared. Reckon it's true." Miss Marple smiled, slipping him a penny. "Ghosts are often just stories, Tommy," she said. "But your gran might know more about that governess. Could you ask her to tell me what she remembers?" Tommy nodded, pocketing the coin with a grin, and scampered off into the night. Miss Marple closed the door, her mind turning to the idea of ghosts. Not the spectral kind, but the shadows of the past Lillian Marsh, the stolen brooch, the man. At the oak, she thought of Colonel Dane, too, his death too convenient, too tidy. Had he known something about Lillian, or the burglary? Had the needle been his, or hers, or someone else's entirely? She opened her notebook and wrote, "Lillian Marsh, governess, left 1905 after burglary. Possible lover, unsuitable man. Locket, with photograph, inscribed forever. Burglary involved sapphire brooch. Stranger seen near Greystone Hall. Butler Grayson, sacked. Clara's unease, growing guilt or fear. Tom's quarrel at Blue Boar investigate. Ask Tommy's grandmother about Lillian." She closed the notebook, her eyes drifting to the fire. The village was settling into sleep, but Miss Marple's mind was awake, piecing together the fragments of a story that spanned decades. The knitting needle was a slender thread, but it led to a tangle of secrets: love, betrayal, theft, perhaps even murder. She would return to Greystone Hall tomorrow, and perhaps speak to Tom, whose silence was louder than words. For now, she let the fire's warmth ease her, her thoughts as intricate as the lace curtains that framed her window. St. Mary Mead might be a quiet place, but its shadows held stories, and Miss Marple was determined to bring them into the light. Chapter 6. The gardener's tale. The rain that had threatened St. Mary Mead the previous evening arrived with a quiet insistence. pattering against the windows of Miss Jane Marple's cottage as she breakfasted on tea and a boiled egg. The village was subdued under a grey sky, its lanes slick with wet leaves and its chimneys trailing thin threads of smoke. Miss Marple, undeterred by the weather, donned her mackintosh and a sturdy hat, her black handbag tucked under her arm like a shield. The knitting needle from Greystone Hall's attic was a persistent thorn in her thoughts, pricking at her curiosity with every new detail. Today, she resolved to speak to Tom, the gardener, whose sullen demeanour and evasive glances suggested he knew more than he let on. In a village like St. Mary Mead, silence was often louder than words, and Miss Marple had a knack for hearing what was left unsaid. The path to Greystone Hall was muddy, and Miss Marple picked her way carefully, her boots sinking slightly into the soft earth. The manor loomed ahead, its stone walls darkened by the rain, its ivy glistening like a living curtain. The air was heavy with the scent of wet grass and wood smoke, and the distant bleat of sheep carried from the fields beyond. As she approached, she saw Tom near the rose garden, his broad shoulders hunched under a waxed jacket, his shears snipping at the thorny stems with a precision that bordered on mechanical. He did not look up as she drew near, but she sensed his awareness, the slight tightening of his grip on the shears. "Good morning, Tom," Miss Marple called, her voice carrying a cheerful note that belied her purpose. "A damp day for gardening, but I dare say the roses appreciate it." Tom grunted, his eyes fixed on the roses, their petals bruised by the rain. "They'll do," he said, his voice gruff. "Roses always do, rain or shine." He clipped another stem, the snip sharp in the quiet air, and Miss Marple noted the way his hands moved steady, but with a tension that suggested more than thorns were on his mind. She stepped closer, sheltering under the brim of her hat. "You've been at Greystone Hall a long time, haven't you, Tom? You must know the place better than most. I was wondering if you'd ever heard of a Lillian Marsh, a governess here years ago." Tom's shears paused, just for a moment, before resuming their work. "Can't say I have," he replied, his tone flat. "Before my time, that'd be... I came on when the Danes bought the place, 20 years back." He turned slightly, his face shadowed by his cap, but Miss Marple caught the flicker in his eyes, a wariness that spoke louder than his words. "Of course," she said, her smile as gentle as ever. "But old houses like this, they hold onto their stories, don't they? That knitting needle found in the attic, for instance, stirred up quite a bit of talk. You didn't happen to see it up there, did you, when you were fixing that leak last spring?" Tom's hand stilled, and he straightened, his eyes narrowing. "I don't go poking about in attics, Miss Marple. My work's out here, with the earth and the plants. If there's a needle, it's nothing to do with me." His voice was firm, but there was a crack in it, like a stone split by frost, and Miss Marple noted it. She nodded, as though satisfied, and turned her attention to the roses, their red petals stark against the grey day. "Such lovely flowers," she said. "I remember a girl who used to work at the hall, years ago, Mary was it, or perhaps Maggie. She was fond of roses, I believe, and you were quite friendly with her, weren't you?" Tom's face darkened, and he jabbed the shears into the soil, his movements abrupt. "You mean Maggie Cole?" he said, his voice low. "She was a housemaid here, back when the Colonel was alive. Nice girl, but she left sudden-like. Went to London, or so they said. Nothing to do with me." He turned away, resuming his work, with a vigour that suggested he wished to end the conversation. Miss Marple watched him, her eyes as sharp as the shears he wielded. Maggie Cole, she thought, another name to add to the tapestry. She recalled a snippet of gossip from Mrs. Bantry about a housemaid who had left Greystone Hall under a cloud. Not long after Colonel Dane's death, had Maggie been connected to Lillian Marsh or to the Colonel's secrets? And why had Tom's voice tightened at the mention of her name? "Thank you, Tom," Miss Marple said, her tone light. "I won't keep you from your work, but if you remember anything about Maggie, or that needle, you'll let me know, won't you?" She smiled, and Tom gave a curt nod, his eyes fixed on the roses as though they held the answers she sought. As she walked back to the house, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the attic, the needle, and the trunk marked LM. The letter she had taken, with its plea for a midnight meeting, suggested a romance gone error, perhaps something darker. Lillian Marsh had vanished after the 1905 burglary, and now Maggie Cole, another girl tied to Greystone Hall, had left under mysterious circumstances. She thought of the locket, with its photograph and the word forever, and wondered if it had belonged to Lillian or to someone who loved her. Elspeth was in the drawing room, her hands busy with embroidery that seemed more a distraction than a craft. She looked up as Miss Marple entered, her face pale but eager. "Jane, have you found anything? About the needle, I mean. I keep thinking about it, and it's making me so uneasy." Miss Marple settled into a chair, declining the offer of tea. "I've been thinking about it too, Elspeth," she said. "That trunk in the attic, with the initials L. Emmett, belonged to a Lillian Marsh, a governess here in 1905. She left suddenly, after a burglary at the hall. Did your husband ever mention her, or anything about the previous owners?" Elspeth shook her head, her needle pausing mid-stitch. "George never talked about the past, not like that. He bought the house because it was a bargain. He said the Haverfords were desperate to sell after the burglary. But he didn't like questions, Jane. He'd get so cross if I asked about the house's history." Her voice trembled, and Miss Marple noted the shadow that crossed her face, as though the memory of her husband's temper lingered still. "And Maggie Cole?" Miss Marple asked gently. "The housemaid who worked here when you first moved in. Did she ever mention anything about the attic or the Haverfords?" Elspeth's eyes widened. "Maggie? Oh, she was a sweet girl, but so quiet. She left not long after we came, said she had a job in London, but it was all very sudden. I thought she was homesick, perhaps." "Why do you ask?" Miss Marple smiled, evading the question. "Just tying up loose ends, my dear. Old houses have so many stories, don't they?" She rose, promising to return soon, and stepped out into the rain, her mind racing. Maggie Cole's departure, like Lillian's, had been abrupt, and Tom's reaction suggested a connection. Had Maggie known something about the needle, or the burglary, or even Colonel Dane's death? As she walked home, the rain pattering on her umbrella, Miss Marple passed the churchyard, where the gravestone of Mary Marsh stood among the others. She paused, her eyes tracing the weathered inscription. Mary Marsh, died 1890, perhaps Lillian's mother, or an aunt. The name was a thread, linking the past to the present, and Miss Marple was determined to follow it. Back in her cottage, she settled by the fire, her knitting needles resuming their steady rhythm. She opened her notebook and wrote, "Tom, evasive about Lillian Marsh. Tense about Maggie Cole, housemaid who left suddenly. Possible connection to Colonel Dane's death. Lillian's letter suggests secret meeting, perhaps with lover involved. In burglary, locket inscribed forever Lillian's, or her lover's. Mary Marsh, died 1890, likely relative. Investigate Maggie Cole's departure. Speak to Tommy's grandmother. She closed the notebook, her eyes drifting to the flames. The rain drummed against the windows, a soft counterpoint to her thoughts. The knitting needle was a slender clue, but it pointed to a web of secret love, theft, betrayal, perhaps murder. Miss Marple knew that St. Mary Mead, for all its quiet charm, was a place where the past never truly slept. Tomorrow, she would seek out Tommy's grandmother, and perhaps revisit the attic, where the loose board still waited. For now, she let the fire's warmth soothe her, her mind as sharp as the needle that had set this mystery in motion. Chapter 7. The Unexpected Visitor. The sun dipped low over St. Mary Mead, casting long shadows across the village as the day softened into dusk. Miss Jane Marple sat by her cottage window, her knitting needles moving with their usual quiet rhythm, though her thoughts were far from the scarf taking shape in her hands. The tarnished knitting needle from Greystone Hall's attic, the trunk marked L.M., and the locket, with its poignant inscription forever, had stirred a mystery that grew more intricate by the day. Lillian Marsh, the governess, who vanished in 1905 after a burglary at the hall, was a shadow in the village's past, her story tied to a sapphire brooch and whispers of scandal. Miss Marple's conversation with Mrs. Bantry had added threads to the tapestry rumours of a lover, a stolen jewel, a dismissed butler, but the pattern remained incomplete. She resolved to return to Greystone Hall to probe further into the attic's secrets and the reticence of its inhabitants. The evening air was cool as she walked to the manor, her black handbag tucked under her arm, her hat a modest affair with a single feather pinned firmly in place. The lanes of St. Mary Mead were quiet, save for the rustle of leaves and the distant bark of a dog. Greystone Hall stood at the end of the gravel drive, its stone facade softened by ivy, though its windows seemed to hold a watchful stillness. Miss Marple noted a new detail as she approached, a sleek black motorcar parked near the gate, its polished surface at odds with the manor's faded grandeur. A visitor, she thought, and an unexpected one. Given Elspeth's nervous disposition and her dislike of surprises, Elspeth greeted her at the door, her face pale and her hands fluttering, like startled birds. "Oh, Jane, I'm so glad you've come," she said, her voice trembling. "Something's happened. My cousin, Evelyn Carter, arrived this afternoon, quite out of the blue. She says she's here for a visit, but I haven't seen her in years. And with all this business about the needle, I'm quite undone." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened, though her smile remained serene. "A cousin, you say? How delightful. I'd love to meet her, Elspeth, and perhaps we could have another look at the attic to set your mind at ease." Elspeth nodded, leading her into the drawing room, where the air was heavy with the scent of lavender and old wood. Evelyn Carter sat by the fire, her posture elegant but her expression guarded. She was a striking woman, perhaps 40, with dark hair swept into a neat chignon and eyes that held a quiet intensity. Her dress, a tailored navy frock, spoke of city sophistication, and her hands, adorned with a single silver ring, rested calmly in her lap. She rose as Miss Marple entered, offering a polite smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "Miss Marple, I presume," she said, her voice smooth but with a faint edge. "Elspeth's told me so much about you. I'm Evelyn, her cousin from London." "How charming to meet you, Mrs. Carter," Miss Marple replied, settling into a chair with her handbag on her knees. A surprise visit must be such a comfort to Elspeth, especially with all this talk of knitting needles and old trunks. "Have you been to Greystone Hall before?" Evelyn's smile tightened, and she glanced at Elspeth, who was fussing with a tea tray. "Not since I was a child," she said. "I've always been fond of old houses, though." Elspeth mentioned the attic, such a treasure trove of history, don't you think? Her tone was light, but Miss Marple noted the way her fingers tightened on her ring, a small tell of unease. Mrs. Baxter bustled in with tea, her face sour as she set down a tray of overbaked scones and lukewarm tea. No proper help with Clara. "Dawdling," she muttered, casting a glance at Evelyn as though she were an unwelcome guest. Miss Marple sipped her tea politely, her eyes never leaving Evelyn. "The attic is quite fascinating," she said. "We found a knitting needle there, quite old and bent, near a trunk with the initials LM and a locket with a photograph inside. It stirred up quite a bit of talk in the village." Evelyn's teacup rattled slightly in its saucer, and she set it down with care. "A knitting needle," she said, her voice steady but her eyes flicking to the table. "How curious. I suppose old houses are full of such oddities." Her words were casual, but Miss Marple saw the tension in her shoulders, the way her gaze lingered on the doorway as though expecting an interruption. Elspeth, oblivious to the undercurrents, wrung her hands. "It's all so unsettling, Jane. First the needle, then all this talk of Lillian Marsh and that burglary years ago. And now Clara's been acting so strange, jumpy, always looking over her shoulder. I don't know what's come over her." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of gentle sympathy, though her mind was racing. Evelyn's arrival, so soon after the needle's discovery, was no coincidence, she was certain. Her interest in the attic, her unease at the mention of the locket, there was a connection to Lillian Marsh, perhaps familial, perhaps something more. She thought of Tom, the gardener, whose sullen silence and recent quarrel at the Blue Boar suggested he, too, held pieces of the puzzle. "Perhaps we could look at the attic again," Miss Marple suggested, her tone light. "It might put our minds at rest, and Mrs. Carter might enjoy seeing the history you've uncovered." Elspeth Evelyn hesitated, then nodded, her smile thin but acquiescent. They climbed the narrow stairs, the air growing colder and dustier with each step. The attic was as Miss Marple remembered it, a shadowed maze of trunks, crates, and forgotten relics, with the knitting needle still resting on its table, its bent tip catching the faint light from the skylight. Evelyn's eyes scanned the space, lingering on the trunk marked LM. Miss Marple watched her closely, noting the way her hands clenched at her sides. "This is where the needle was found," she said, pointing to the corner near the trunk. "And the locket, with its photograph of a young woman. Quite striking." "Really, have you ever come across such a locket in your family, Mrs. Carter?" Evelyn's face remained composed, but her voice was tight. "No, I'm afraid not. My family's not much for keepsakes." She moved toward the trunk, her fingers brushing its surface as though drawn to it, and Miss Marple noted the gesture, as deliberate as it was fleeting. They descended to the drawing room, where Elspeth poured more tea, her hands trembling. Miss Marple excused herself, promising to return soon, and stepped into the evening air. The motor car was still parked by the gate, its presence a silent question. As she walked home, she passed Tom in the garden, his rake moving with a restless energy. She raised a hand in greeting, but he merely nodded, his eyes avoiding hers. Miss Marple smiled to herself. Evelyn's arrival had stirred the household, and Clara's unease, Tom's silence, and the attic secrets were all threads in a tapestry that was slowly taking shape. Back in her cottage, Miss Marple settled by the fire, her knitting needles resuming their steady rhythm. She opened her notebook and wrote, "Evelyn Carter claims to be Elspeth's cousin. Arrived unexpectedly. Interest in attic suggests hidden motive. Possible connection to Lillian Marsh family or otherwise. Clara's nervousness, increasing fear of Evelyn. Tom's quarrel at Blue Ball linked to Evelyn's arrival. Locket and letter point to Lillian's secret lover, perhaps tied to burglary. Investigate Evelyn's background. Speak to Tommy's grandmother about Maggie Cole." She closed the notebook, her eyes fixed on the flames. The village of St. Mary Mead was quiet, its lights winking out one by one as the night deepened. But Miss Marple's mind was far from restful. The knitting needle, the locket, the letter. The stranger, they were pieces of a puzzle, and she was determined to fit them together. Tomorrow, she would return to Greystone Hall and perhaps confront Evelyn with a carefully worded question or two. For now, she let the fire's warmth ease her, her thoughts as intricate as the lace curtains that framed her window. In St. Mary Mead, secrets had a way of rising to the surface, and Miss Marple was ready to meet them. Chapter 8. The locket's cloth. Rain had ceased by morning, leaving St. Mary Mead glistening under a sky of pale, uncertain blue. Miss Jane Marple, fortified by a breakfast of tea and toast, sat at her small writing desk, the silver locket from Greystone Hall's attic resting before her like a talisman. Its tarnished surface caught the light, revealing faint etchings of vines that curled around its edges, and the tiny photograph within a young woman with dark curls and defiant eyes seemed to gaze back at her. The word "forever," etched on the back, carried a weight of promise and loss that tugged at Miss Marple's thoughts. The knitting needle, the letters, the trunk marked L.M., and now the arrival of Evelyn Carter were threads in a tapestry that grew more intricate by the day, and Miss Marple was determined to trace them to their source. She had borrowed the locket from Elspeth Dane under the pretense of having it cleaned, a small deception she justified by the need to examine it privately. The photograph, she was certain, was of Lillian Marsh, the governess who had vanished from Greystone Hall in 1905 after the theft of a sapphire brooch. The locket's presence in the attic, alongside the knitting needle and the urgent letter, suggested a story of love, betrayal, or something darker. Miss Marple's mind, as sharp as the needle itself, turned to Evelyn Carter, the elegant stranger whose arrival had stirred unease in the household. Her interest in the attic, her rattled teacup at the mention of the needle, these were not the actions of a casual visitor. Miss Marple resolved to learn more about her, but first she would seek the expertise of Mr. Pye, the antique dealer, whose knowledge of such trinkets might reveal another piece of the puzzle. The walk to Mr. Pye's shop was brisk, the village lanes still damp from the night's rain. St. Mary Mead was stirring into life, with the milkman's cart rattling past and Mrs. Weatherby sweeping her doorstep with a vigour that suggested she was eager for gossip. Miss Marple nodded politely to passers-by, her serene smile masking the calculations behind her eyes. The shop, a cluttered haven of curiosities, smelled of polish and old leather, its shelves crowded with porcelain figures, tarnished silver, and faded books. Mr. Pye emerged from the back, his thin face alight with a smile that was both welcoming and wary. "Miss Marple, how delightful," he said, adjusting his spectacles. "Have you come to browse, or is there another mystery afoot?" His tone was playful, but his eyes flicked to her handbag, as though he sensed she carried something of interest. "I've a small item I'd like your opinion on," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but deliberate. She opened her handbag and produced the locket, holding it out in her gloved hand. It was found in the attic at Greystone Hall, alongside that knitting needle I mentioned. I thought you might know something about its make, or perhaps its history. Mr. Pye's fingers closed around the locket, his touch reverent as he turned it over in the light. A fine piece, he murmured, peering through his spectacles. Silver, mid-19th century, I'd say, with hand-etched detailing. Not a common trinket, likely a gift, given the craftsmanship. He opened it, studying the photograph and the inscription. Forever, he read aloud, his brow furrowing. A lover's token, perhaps. The photograph is well preserved, though the frames seem better days. Found in the attic, you say? Curious, very curious. Miss Marple watched him closely, noting the slight hesitation in his voice. Do you recognize it, Mr. Pye? Or perhaps you've heard of such a locket being associated with Greystone Hall? Mr. Pye's smile tightened, and he set the locket down carefully. I can't say I have, Miss Marple. Greystone Halls had so many owners, and lockets like this were common enough in their day. But he paused, as though weighing his words. I do recall a story, years ago, about Colonel Dane. He pawned a piece of jewelry to settle a debt. Silver, I believe, though I never saw it myself. Could be this locket, or something like it. Debts, you know, were a sore point with the Colonel. His voice was casual, but his fingers tapped the counter, a small betrayal of unease. Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of polite interest. How interesting, she said. Colonel Dane's death was such a sad affair, wasn't it? So sudden, and with all those rumors floating about. A heart attack, they said, but villagers do love their stories. She let the words hang, watching Mr. Pye's face for a reaction. He shrugged, his smile returning but not reaching his eyes. Villagers, indeed, Miss Marple. Always a tale or two to spice things up. I'm afraid I know nothing more about the locket, but I'll keep my ears open. Shall I clean it for you? It'd be no trouble. Miss Marple declined, tucking the locket back into her handbag. You're very kind, Mr. Pye, but I'll manage. Thank you for your time. She left the shop, her mind buzzing. Mr. Pye's mention of the Colonel's debt was a new thread, one that tied the locket to the man whose death had cast a shadow. Over Greystone Hall had the locket belonged to Lillian Marsh, pawned by the Colonel to cover his losses. Or had it been a gift, perhaps from the mysterious lover mentioned in the letter? And what of Evelyn Carter, whose arrival coincided so neatly with the needle's discovery? As she walked home, Miss Marple passed the Blue Boar, where a group of men were unloading barrels, their laughter muted by the damp air. She thought of Tom's quarrel there, mentioned by the men outside the pub, and wondered if it was connected to Evelyn's presence. The stranger, with her sharp eyes and guarded smile, was a puzzle in herself, and Miss Marple resolved to observe her more closely at the next opportunity. Back in her cottage, she settled by the fire, the locket resting on the table beside her. Knitting, she opened it again, studying the photograph of the young woman Lillian. She was certain. The defiance in her eyes spoke of a spirit unbroken, despite the scandal that had driven her from the village. Miss Marple thought of Mrs. Bant's tale of Lillian crying in the churchyard, clutching a locket, and of the burglary that had cost the Haverfords their sapphire brooch. Had Lillian been involved, or had she been a scapegoat? Her departure a flight from injustice? Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Tommy Pierce, the paper boy, his cap dripping with rain and his grin as wide as ever. Gran says she remembers Maggie Cole. Miss Marple, he announced, bouncing on his heels. Says she was a housemaid at Greystone Hall, back when the Colonel was alive. Left sudden-like, after a row with him. Gran thinks she was sweet on Tom, the gardener, but he never said nothing about it. Want me to ask her more? Miss Marple smiled, slipping him another penny. You're a good lad, Tommy. Yes, ask her if Maggie ever mentioned a governess, or a locket, or anything about the attic. And be quick about it, before the rain soaks you through. Tommy nodded and darted off, leaving a trail of muddy footprints on her path. She returned to her chair, her knitting needles clicking softly as she resumed work on Raymond's scarf. The locket, the needle, the letter, Evelyn Carter, Maggie Cole. Colonel Dane's death, they were all connected, she was sure, but the pattern was still unclear. She thought of Clara's pale face, her nervous hands, and Tom's sullen silence. Each held a piece of the truth, and Miss Marple was adept at coaxing truths from reluctant tongues. She opened her notebook and wrote, Locket, silver, mid-19th century, likely Lillian Marsh's, inscribed forever. Suggests lover. Mr. Pye mentions Colonel Dane pawning silver, possible link to locket. Evelyn Carter's interest in attic searching for locket or something else. Maggie Cole, housemaid, left after quarrel with Colonel, possibly involved with Tom. Clara's fear growing knows more than she says. Ask Tommy's grandmother about Maggie and locket. She closed the notebook, her eyes drifting to the fire. The rain had begun again, a soft patter against the windows, and the village was settling into the quiet of late afternoon. Miss Marple's mind, however, was far from quiet. The locket was a clue, a tangible link to Lillian Marsh and the secrets of Greystone Hall. Tomorrow, she would return to the hall, perhaps to question Evelyn directly, or to revisit the attics. Loose board, which she suspected hid more than dust. For now, she let the fire's warmth ease her, her thoughts as intricate as the vines etched on the locket. In St. Mary Mead, the past was never truly past, and Miss Marple was ready to bring its shadows into the light. Chapter 9. The twist of the needle. The morning dawned grey and heavy over St. Mary Mead, the clouds low and brooding, as though mirroring the unease that had settled over the village. Miss Jane Marple sat at her breakfast table, her tea cooling, as she turned a silver locket over in her hands. The photograph of Lillian Marsh gazed back at her, its defiant eyes a silent challenge to unravel the secrets of Greystone Hall. The knitting needle, the letters, the trunk marked LM, and now Evelyn Carter's unsettling presence had woven a complex web. But it was the sudden disappearance of Clara, the maid, that sharpened Miss Marple's focus. The news had reached her late the previous evening, carried by a breathless Tommy Pierce, who reported that Clara had vanished from Greystone Hall, leaving behind a half-packed bag and no note. The village buzzed with speculation, but Miss Marple knew that gossip was a poor substitute for truth. She resolved to return to the attic, where the needle had been found, and to uncover the secret that had driven Clara to flee. The walk to Greystone Hall was somber, the lanes slick with the remnants of last night's rain. Miss Marple's boots crunched on the gravel drive, and she noted the eerie stillness of the manor, its windows dark and uninviting. Elspeth Dane met her at the door, her face ashen, her hands trembling as she clutched her shawl. "Oh, Jane." "It's dreadful," she cried, her voice breaking. "Clara's gone, just like that, and I don't know what to make of it. She was such a good girl, so quiet. Why would she leave without a word?" Miss Marple patted her arm, her expression one of calm reassurance. "There's always a reason, Elspeth, even if it's not clear at first. May I see her room, and perhaps the attic again? I believe there's more to learn there. Elspeth nodded, too distraught to question, and led the way upstairs, her steps faltering as though the house itself weighed on her. Clara's room was a small, Spartan space off the servants' quarters, its walls bare save for a single crucifix above. The bed, the half-packed bag sat on a chair, its contents a few dresses, a comb, a worn Bible spilling out as though abandoned in haste. Miss Marple examined it closely, noting a scrap of paper tucked beneath the Bible. It was a torn fragment of a letter written in a hurried hand. ... Must leave. It's not safe. The needle ... The rest was missing, but the words sent a chill through Miss Marple. She slipped the fragment into her handbag, her mind racing. Clara had known something about the needle, something that frightened her enough to flee. They climbed to the attic, where the air was thick with dust and the faint scent of mildew. The skylight cast a pallid glow, illuminating the cluttered space. Trunks, crates, a broken spinning wheel, and the table where the knitting needle still lay, its bent tip glinting like an accusation. Miss Marple moved to the corner where the needle had been found, near the trunk marked LM. She knelt, her fingers tracing the floorboards, and found the loose board she had noticed before. This time with Elspeth, distracted by her own nervous chatter. Miss Marple pried it up, revealing a small compartment beneath. Inside, nestled in a bed of dust, was a single sapphire, its deep blue catching the light like a star in the night. Sky Elspeth gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Jane, what is that? Is it the brooch? Not the brooch, Miss Marple said, her voice steady but her eyes alight with discovery. But a part of it, I think. The sapphire brooch stolen. In 1905, from the Haverfords' time. This must be one of its stones. She turned the gem in her fingers, its facets cold and unyielding. The knitting needle, she realized, was no ordinary tool. Its bent tip suggested it had been used to pry open this very compartment, perhaps by Lillian Marsh, or someone else who knew its secret. She stood, brushing dust from her skirt, and turned to Elspeth. This changes things, my dear. Clara's disappearance, this sapphire, the needle there, all connected. Tell me, has Evelyn Carter been in the attic since she arrived? Elspeth frowned, her hands twisting her shawl. Not that I know of, Jane. She's been so kind, helping with small things. But she did ask about the attic, said she was curious about old houses. I thought it was just her way, you know, being interested in family history. Her voice wavered, and Miss Marple noted the doubt in her eyes, as though she were beginning to question her cousin's motives. They descended to the drawing room, where Mrs. Baxter served tea with a scowl, muttering about Clara's ingratitude. Miss Marple sipped the bitter brew, her mind turning over the new evidence. The sapphire was a tangible link to the 1905 burglary, and Clara's flight suggested she had stumbled upon it or its implications. Had she found the stone while cleaning, or had she known of it all along? And what of Evelyn Carter, whose arrival had coincided so neatly with the needle's discovery? Miss Marple thought of the locket, the letter, and the word forever, and wondered if Evelyn was tied to Lillian Marsh in ways yet to be revealed, as she prepared to leave. She caught sight of Tom in the garden, raking leaves with a ferocity that suggested he was working off some private anger. She stepped outside, undeterred by the damp grass, and approached him. Tom, she said, her voice gentle but firm, Clara's gone, and I think you know more than you're saying. Did she tell you anything about the attic, or the needle? Before she left, Tom's rake paused, and he turned, his face shadowed by his cap. "Clara didn't say nothing to me," he growled. "She was scared, that's all. Kept muttering about the attic, like it was haunted. I told her it was nonsense, but she wouldn't listen." His eyes met hers, then slid away, and Miss Marple noted the tension in his jaw, the way his hands gripped the rake. "Thank you, Tom," she said, her smile unwavering. "If you hear from her, you'll let me know, won't you?" He nodded curtly, resuming his work, but Miss Marple sensed the weight of his silence, heavy with unspoken truths. The walk back to the village was slow, the sapphire in her handbag a secret as heavy as stone. She thought of Lillian Marsh, fleeing after the burglary, and Clara, fleeing now, her note hinting at danger. The needle, she realized, was more than a toolet, was a key used to unlock a hidden compartment. Perhaps by Lillian, perhaps by someone else. Had Clara found the sapphire and feared its discovery would expose her? Or was she running from someone of Evelyn, perhaps, or even Tom? Back in her cottage, Miss Marple settled by the fire, her knitting needles clicking softly as she resumed work. On Raymond's scarf, she opened the locket, studying Lillian's photograph, and reread the torn fragment of Clara's note, ... "Must leave, it's not safe, the needle, ... The pieces were falling into place, but the pattern was still incomplete. She thought of Colonel Dane's death, the rumors of a woman leaving the house, the debts that had plagued him. Had he known of the sapphire, hidden all those years? Had Clara, or someone else, uncovered a truth too dangerous to keep? She opened her notebook and wrote, "Sapphire found in attic compartment, likely from 1905, brooch. Needle used to pry it. Open, Clara's disappearance, tied to discovery. Her note suggests fear. Evelyn Carter's interest in attic searching for sapphire. Tom, protective of Clara, but hiding something. Colonel Dane's death, heart attack or murder. Investigate. Evelyn's true identity, trace Clara's whereabouts." She closed the notebook, her eyes fixed on the flames. The village was quiet. The rain a distant memory, but Miss Marple's mind was alive with questions. The sapphire was a clue, a glittering thread in a web of secrets. Tomorrow she would seek out Evelyn, perhaps with a question sharp enough to pierce her guarded facade. For now, she let the fire's warmth soothe her, her thoughts as intricate as the stitches in her knitting. In St. Mary Mead, the past was a restless ghost, and Miss Marple was ready to lay it to rest. Chapter 10. The past unravelled. The morning light crept into St. Mary Mead with a tentative glow, as though wary of disturbing the village's secrets. Miss Jane Marple sat by her window, her knitting needles still for once, as she turned the sapphire over in her hands. Its deep blue facets caught the light, a silent testament to the burglary at Greystone Hall in 1905, when a valuable brooch had vanished along with Lillian Marsh, the governess whose name echoed through the attic's relics. The discovery of the sapphire, hidden beneath a loose board and likely pried open by the bent knitting needle, had sharpened the mystery, and Clara's sudden disappearance, her cryptic note hinting at danger, had added a new urgency. Miss Marple's mind, as keen as ever, was weaving the threads together, the needle, the locket, the letter, Evelyn Carter's arrival, and now the sapphire. Each a piece of a puzzle that pointed to a truth buried in the past. She had resolved to speak to Evelyn Carter, the enigmatic stranger who claimed to be Elspeth Dane's cousin, but whose interest in the attic suggested a deeper purpose. Miss Marple's instincts, honed by years of observing human nature, told her that Evelyn's polished manners and sharp eyes hid a story of her own. The village was abuzz with Clara's disappearance, and Miss Marple knew that time was short secrets. Like wool left too long in a basket, had a way of unraveling if pulled just right. She slipped the sapphire and locket into her handbag, donned her coat and hat, and set out for Greystone Hall, her steps brisk despite the damp chill in the air. The manor stood sombre under a sky heavy with clouds, its stone walls glistening. From the morning's dew, Elspeth greeted her at the door, her face drawn and her hands twisting the fringe of her shawl. "Jane, I'm at my wit's end," she said, her voice trembling. "Clara's gone, and now the village is talking, saying she stole something, or worse. And Evelyn's been so quiet since yesterday, hardly speaking at all. I don't know what to think." Miss Marple patted her arm, her smile reassuring. "We'll sort it out, Elspeth. May I see Evelyn? I'd like to have a little chat with her, if she's about." Elspeth nodded, leading her to the drawing room, where Evelyn sat by the window, a book open in her lap, but her eyes fixed on the garden beyond. She looked up as Miss Marple entered, her expression composed, but her fingers tightening on the book's edges. "Good morning, Mrs. Carter," Miss Marple said, settling into a chair with her usual air of gentle curiosity. "I hope I'm not disturbing you. I've been thinking about that knitting needle we found in the attic, and I wondered if you might have any thoughts on it. You seem so interested in old houses, and Greystone Hall has such a history." Evelyn's smile was polite but guarded, her eyes flicking to Miss Marple's handbag as though sensing its contents. "I'm afraid I know little about knitting." "Needles," she said, her voice smooth but with a faint edge. "As for the house, it's charming, but I'm only here to visit Elspeth. Family, you know, is so important." Her accent, Miss Marple noted, slipped slightly on the word family, hinting at a less refined background than her elegant attire suggested. Miss Marple nodded, her fingers resting lightly on her handbag. "Of course, but it's curious. Isn't it how the past lingers in places like this? I found a locket in the attic with a photograph inside a young woman, quite striking. And there was a letter, too, addressed to a Lillian Marsh. Does that name mean anything to you, Evelyn's?" Composure faltered, her book slipping slightly in her hands. "Lillian Marsh," she said, her voice steady but her eyes betraying a flicker of alarm. "I've never heard of her. Why do you ask?" Her fingers tightened further, and Miss Marple saw the faint tremor in them, like a thread pulled to taut. Double quotes, "Oh, just a whim," Miss Marple said, her tone light but her eyes sharp. "The locket had an inscription, 'Forever,' and I couldn't help but notice you resemble the woman in the photograph. Quite a coincidence, don't you think?" It was a calculated guess, but it struck home. Evelyn's face paled, and her book fell to the floor with a soft thud. She recovered quickly, forcing a laugh. "A coincidence, indeed, Miss Marple. I'm afraid I have no connection to any governesses or lockets. My family's from London, quite ordinary." But her voice was strained, and Miss Marple noted the way her eyes darted to the door, as though seeking escape. They were interrupted by Mrs. Baxter, who bustled in with a tray of tea, her face sour. "No biscuits today," she muttered. "With Clara gone, it's all I can manage." Miss Marple thanked her, sipping the tea politely while her mind raced. Evelyn's reaction confirmed her suspicions. She was tied to Lillian Marsh, perhaps by blood or by purpose. The sapphire, the needle, Clara's flytool were linked, and Evelyn was at the heart of it. After tea, Miss Marple excused herself, promising to return soon. As she stepped into the hall, she caught sight of Tom in the garden, his rake moving. With a restless energy, she thought of his quarrel at the Blue Boar, his protectiveness over Clara, and wondered if he, too, was entangled in Evelyn's secrets. She made a mental note to speak to him again, perhaps with a question sharp enough to pierce his silence. Back in the village, Miss Marple stopped at the post office, where Miss Hartnell was regaling Mrs. Weatherby with tales of Clara's disappearance. "Run off with a man, I'll wager," Miss Hartnell declared, her eyes gleaming. "Or maybe she took something from the hall. There's talk of a jewel, you know." Miss Marple listened, her expression one of mild interest, but her mind was elsewhere. The village gossip was a distraction, but it confirmed that the sapphire's discovery was already leaking into the public ear at home. She settled by the fire, the locket and sapphire on the table beside her knitting. She opened the letter from the attic, rereading its desperate plea. "I must see you before all is lost." She thought of Lillian Marsh fleeing after the burglary, and Evelyn, whose resemblance to the locket's photograph was too striking to be chance. Had Evelyn come to Greystone Hall seeking the sapphire, or something more persona legacy perhaps, or revenge? A knock at the door broke her thoughts. It was Tommy Pierce, his cap sodden from a fresh drizzle. "Gran says Maggie Cole was sweet on Tom, sure enough," he reported, his eyes wide. "Said Maggie left after a row with the Colonel, something about money he owed her, and she mentioned a locket once, said it was cursed, or some such. Want me to ask more?" Miss Marple slipped him a penny, her smile warm. "You're a treasure, Tommy. Yes, ask if Maggie ever spoke of Lillian Marsh, or a sapphire. And mind the rain, now." He nodded and darted off, leaving her to her thoughts. She opened her notebook and wrote, "Evelyn Carter, likely tied to Lillian Marsh daughter. Her reaction to locket suggests knowledge. Sapphire from 1905 burglary, hidden by Lillian or accomplice. Clara's note mentions needle, implies danger. Tom, protective of Clara, possibly knew Maggie Cole's secrets. Colonel Dane's quarrel with Maggie linked to locket or sapphire. Seek Clara's whereabouts, question Evelyn further." She closed the notebook, her eyes drifting to the fire. The village was settling into evening, its lights glowing softly through the drizzle. Miss Marple's mind was a whirl of threads: Lillian's flight, Evelyn's motives, Clara's fear, Tom's silence. The sapphire was a key, but to what lock? Tomorrow, she would arrange a gathering at Greystone Hall to watch Evelyn and Tom, under the pressure of her gentle scrutiny. For now, she let the fire's warmth ease her, her thoughts as intricate as the stitches in her knitting. In St. Mary Mead, secrets were like shadows, ever present and waiting to be illuminated. Chapter 11. The Colonel's Secret. The morning broke over St. Mary Mead with a tentative sun, its rays piercing the lingering mist to cast long shadows across the village. Miss Jane Marple sat at her breakfast table, her tea steaming gently as she contemplated the sapphire now hidden in a velvet pouch in her handbag. The gem, pried from its secret compartment in Greystone Hall's attic, was a tangible link to the 1905 burglary that had driven Lillian Marsh from the village. The knitting needle, the locket inscribed forever, Evelyn Carter's guarded demeanor, and Clara's sudden flightal were threads in a tapestry that grew ever more intricate. Miss Marple's mind, as sharp as the needle itself, was piecing together a pattern that pointed to Colonel Dane's death 5 years ago. A death too neatly attributed to a heart attack. She sensed that Evelyn held the key to unraveling this mystery, and she resolved to draw her out with a carefully woven net of questions. The walk to Greystone Hall was brisk. the air sharp with the scent of damp leaves and woods. The village was stirring, with the baker's boy whistling as he pedalled past and Mrs. Hartnell sweeping her doorstep with a vigour that suggested she was eager for the day's gossip. Miss Marple's black handbag swung lightly at her side, the sapphire and locket within a silent reminder of the secrets she carried. The manor loomed ahead, its stone facade softened by ivy, but its windows seemed to watch her approach with a wary gaze. She noted a fresh set of tire marks in the gravel drive deeper than before, suggesting a heavier vehicle. A visitor, perhaps, or someone leaving in haste. Elspeth Dane greeted her at the door, her face pale and her hands clutching a handkerchief. "Jane, I'm so glad you're here," she said, her voice trembling. "Evelyn's been so strange since Clara left, hardly speaking, always looking out the window. And the village is full of talk about that jewel you found. I don't know what to make of it all." Miss Marple smiled, her expression one of calm reassurance. "We'll get to the bottom of it, Elspeth. I'd like to speak with Evelyn, if she's about, and perhaps we could have a little gathering later. Nothing formal, just you, Evelyn, and Tom. I find a cup of tea often loosens tongues." Elspeth nodded, too distracted to question the request, and led Miss Marple to the drawing room, where Evelyn sat by the fire, a shawl draped over her shoulders, and a cup of tea untouched at her side. "Good morning, Mrs. Carter," Miss Marple said, settling into a chair with her usual air of gentle curiosity. "I hope you're settling in, despite all this fuss about Clara and the attic. I've been thinking about that locket we found, and the sapphire. Remarkable how such small things can stir up the past, isn't it?" Evelyn's eyes flicked to Miss Marple, her smile tight. "Remarkable, indeed, Miss Marple. But I'm afraid I know nothing about lockets or sapphires. I'm only here to visit Elspeth, as I've said." Her voice was smooth, but her fingers tightened on her shawl, and Miss Marple noted the faint flush that crept up her neck. "Of course," Miss Marple said, her tone light but her eyes sharp. "But I couldn't help noticing your interest in the attic. And the locket, well, the photograph inside bears a striking resemblance to you. It belonged to Lillian Marsh, a governess here in 1905. I wondered if you might be related, perhaps a niece or cousin." Evelyn's composure cracked, her teacup rattling in its saucer. She set it down, her hands trembling, and met Miss Marple's gaze with a mixture of defiance and resignation. "You're very perceptive, Miss Marple," she said, her voice low. "I suppose there's no point in denying it. Lillian Marsh was my mother. I never knew her, she died when I was a baby, but I grew up hearing stories about her time at Greystone Hall. She was wronged, Miss Marple, driven out by lies and scandal. I came here to find what she left behind, to reclaim what was hers." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of gentle sympathy, though her mind was racing. "And the sapphire?" she asked. "Was that what she left behind? Part of the brooch? Stolen in 1905? Evelyn's eyes widened, but she recovered quickly. "I knew about the brooch," she admitted. "My mother's letters once she left with my aunt mentioned it. She didn't steal it, Miss Marple, I swear. She took it to protect herself, to start a new life after Spatat, after he betrayed her." Her voice broke, and she looked away, her hands clenched in her lap. "He," Miss Marple prompted softly, "the man in the letter who asked her to meet at midnight by the oak." Evelyn nodded, her eyes glistening. "He was a soldier, someone she loved. He promised to marry her, but he was married already to a woman in London. When she found out, she was heartbroken. The brooch was her way out. She hid it, meaning to sell it later, but she was found out and had to flee. She left the sapphire behind, hidden in the attic. I came to find it, to right the wrong done to her. Miss Marple leaned back, her knitting needles clicking softly as she resumed work on Raymond's scarf. Evelyn's story was plausible, but it left gaps I had. Clara fled, and what did the needle have to do with it? She thought of Colonel Dane, whose death had been too convenient, and the rumors of a woman leaving the house the night before. And Colonel Dane, she said, her voice gentle but probing. Did your mother ever mention him? He lived here, after the Haverfords, and there were stories, debts, quarrels, a woman seen at the house before he died. Evelyn's face hardened. I know about the Colonel, she said bitterly. He found out about the sapphire, from papers the Haverfords left behind. He blackmailed my mother, threatening to expose her unless she paid him. She had nothing to give, so she ran. I believe he kept looking for the sapphire, even after she was gone. His death, I don't know, Miss Marple. I only know my mother suffered because of him. Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning over this new thread. The Colonel's death, the sapphire, Lillian's flight, all were linked, and Evelyn's arrival had stirred them to the surface. But Clara's disappearance was the missing piece, and Miss Marple suspected it was tied to the needle itself. Had Clara found the sapphire and feared exposure, or had she uncovered something about the Colonel's death? As she prepared to leave, Miss Marple caught sight of Tom in the garden, his rake moving with a restless energy. She thought of his protectiveness over Clara, his quarrel at the Blue Boar, and Maggie Cole, the housemaid who had left after a row with the Colonel. She resolved to arrange the gathering she had mentioned to Elspeth, to watch Evelyn and Tom under the pressure of her gentle scrutiny. Back in the village, she stopped at the vicarage, where Mr. Clement was sorting parish records. She asked about Maggie Cole, hoping for a clue to her connection to Tom or the Colonel. The records showed Maggie had left St. Mary Mead in 1920, shortly after the Colonel's death, with no forwarding address. A note mentioned a disagreement with her employer, but no details. Miss Marple thanked Mr. Clement and walked home, her mind buzzing. At her cottage, she settled by the fire, the locket and sapphire on the table beside her knitting. She opened her notebook and wrote, Evelyn Carter, Lillian Marsh's daughter, came for sapphire. Claims mother was blackmailed by Colonel Dane over 1905 burglary. Colonel's death possible murder. Clara's flight linked to sapphire or needle. Tom, protective of Clara, knew Maggie Cole, who quarrelled with Colonel. Arrange gathering at Greystone Hall to observe Evelyn and Tom. Seek Clara's whereabouts. She closed the notebook, her eyes fixed on the flames. The village was quiet, its lights glowing softly through the mist. Miss Marple's mind was alive, with questions of Evelyn's motives, Clara's fear, Tom's secrets, the Colonel's death. The sapphire was a glittering clue, but the needle was the key, its bent tip pointing to a truth yet to be uncovered. Tomorrow she would set her trap and see who flinched. For now, she let the fire's warmth ease her, her thoughts as intricate as the stitches in her knitting. In St. Mary Mead, the past was a restless shadow, and Miss Marple was ready to bring it into the light. Chapter 12. The trap is set. The afternoon light fell softly over St. Mary Mead, painting the village in hues of gold and grey as the clouds parted to reveal a fragile sun. Miss Jane Marple stood at her cottage window, her knitting needles idle. For once, as she contemplated the web of secrets surrounding Greystone Hall, the sapphire, hidden for decades in the attic's secret compartment, had confirmed the link to the 1905 burglary that had driven Lillian Marsh from the village. Evelyn Carter's revelation as Lillian's daughter, seeking to reclaim her mother's legacy, had added a new thread. But Clara's sudden disappearance and the cryptic note, "Must leave, it's not safe," the needle, suggested a deeper, darker truth. Miss Marple's mind, as sharp as the tarnished knitting needle at the heart of the mystery, was piecing together a pattern that pointed to Colonel Dane's death 5 years ago. A death to neatly labeled a heart attack, to unravel it. She needed to observe the players Evelyn, Tom, and Elspeth under the gentle pressure of her scrutiny. A gathering at Greystone Hall, she decided, would be the perfect trap. She telephoned Elspeth Dane, her voice as calm and reassuring as ever, proposing a small tea that afternoon to discuss Clara's disappearance and ease everyone's nerves. Elspeth, flustered but eager for company, agreed. Promising to invite Evelyn and Tom, Miss Marple slipped the sapphire and locket into her handbag, alongside the torn fragment of Clara's note, and donned her coat and her tailleur, sensible woolen, one with a single brooch, chosen for practicality rather than flair. The walk to Greystone Hall was brisk, the air crisp with the scent of damp earth and fading roses. The village was quiet, save for the chatter of sparrows and the distant clatter of a cart. But Miss Marple's thoughts were alive with anticipation. She knew that secrets, like stitches, could be undone with the right pull. Greystone Hall stood, somber under the afternoon light, its ivy-clad walls absorbing the sun's warmth without reflecting it. Elspeth greeted her at the door, her face pale and her hands fluttering as she led Miss Marple to the drawing room. "I've asked Evelyn and Tom to join us," she said, her voice trembling. "Mrs. Baxter's preparing tea, though she's in a foul mood without Clara to help. I do hope we can make sense of all this, Jane." Miss Marple patted her arm, her smile serene. "We'll do our best, Elspeth. A cup of tea and a little conversation can work wonders." She settled into a chair, her handbag resting on her lap, and surveyed the room. The fire crackled weakly, casting shadows on the faded wallpaper, and the air held a faint trace of lavender and dust. Evelyn entered moments later, her elegant dress at odds with the tension in her posture. She nodded to Miss Marple, her smile tight, and took a seat by the window, her eyes drifting to the garden where Tom was raking leaves with a restless energy. Tom joined them shortly, his boots cleaned but his face shadowed by his cap. He stood awkwardly near the door, declining a chair, his hands clasped behind him as though bracing for an interrogation. Mrs. Baxter bustled in with a tray of tea and scones, her scowl deeper than usual, and muttered something about runaway maids before retreating. Miss Marple poured the tea, her movements deliberate, and passed cups to Elspeth and Evelyn, offering one to Tom, who shook his head. "I thought we might talk about Clara," Miss Marple began, her voice gentle but carrying a quiet authority. "Her leaving so suddenly is troubling, don't you think? And then there's this matter of the attic, the knitting needle, the locket, and now this." She reached into her handbag and produced the sapphire, holding it up so it caught the light, its blue depths glinting like a secret laid bare. Elspeth gasped, her teacup rattling, while Evelyn's face paled, her eyes fixed on the gem. Tom's shoulders stiffened, his hands clenching behind him. "Where did you find that?" Elspeth whispered, her handkerchief pressed to her lips. "Is it the brooch?" "A part of it, I believe," Miss Marple said, her tone calm but her eyes scanning their faces. "Hidden in a compartment in the attic, pried open, I suspect, by the knitting needle. It's from the burglary in 1905, when Lillian Marsh was governess here. Evelyn, you told me Lillian was your mother, driven out by scandal. Did you come looking for this sapphire, to reclaim what she hid? Evelyn's lips parted, but no sound came at first. She set her teacup down, her hands trembling. Yes, I came for the sapphire, she admitted, her voice low. My mother's letters said she hid it to start a new life, after the man she loved betrayed her. I thought it was my right, Miss Marple, to take what was hers. But I didn't know about Clara, or why she left. I swear it. Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of quiet understanding, though her mind was alert. And the needle, she asked, producing it from her handbag and placing it beside the sapphire. Its tip is bent, as though used to pry open that compartment. Did Clara find it, perhaps, and realize its significance? Evelyn shook her head, her eyes wide. I don't know about the needle. I only wanted the sapphire. I searched the attic, but I found nothing until you showed me the locket. I thought it was all I'd have of her. Her voice broke, and Miss Marple noted the sincerity in it. But also, the gaps Evelyn was holding something back. She turned to Tom, who would not move from his place by the door. Tom, you've been at Greystone Hall a long time. You knew Clara, and Maggie Cole before her. Clara was frightened, wasn't she? Frightened enough to run. Did she tell you anything about the needle, or the sapphire? Tom's jaw tightened, and his eyes flicked to Evelyn, then back to Miss Marple. Clara was scared, he said, his voice rough. She found that needle while cleaning, said it gave her the creeps. Then she found something else wouldn't. Say what, but she was shaking, said it wasn't safe to stay. I told her to go, to get away before. He stopped, his hands clenching tighter, and Miss Marple saw the struggle in his face. Before what, Tom? She prompted gently. Before someone hurt her. Or before she revealed what she knew about Colonel Dane's death. The room fell. Silent, the fire's crackle the only sound. Elspeth's eyes widened, her handkerchief falling to her lap. Evelyn's face was a mask, but her hands betrayed her, twisting in her shawl. Tom took a step forward, his voice low and urgent. Clara told me everything, Miss Marple. She found the sapphire, and she knew what it meant knew. It was tied to the Colonel. He wasn't a good man, miss. He used people, like he used Maggie, and Clara after her. Clara, she poisoned him, Miss Marple, not to kill, just to make him ill, to scare him. But it went wrong, and he died. She's been carrying that guilt ever since, and when she found the sapphire, she thought it had all come out. Elspeth gasped, her face crumpling. Poisoned. George, oh, Jane, it can't be true. But Miss Marple's eyes were on Tom, her mind racing. Clara, the quiet maid, had been the Colonel's mistress, discarded when he tired of her. The sapphire, the needle, the attic, they had stirred her guilt, driving her to flee. And you helped her, didn't you, Tom? Miss Marple said softly. Helped her hide, to keep her secret safe. Tom nodded, his shoulders sagging. I couldn't let her face it alone. She was scared, Miss Marple. I told her to go to my sister's in the next village, to lay low. I didn't know about the sapphire till she told me, but I knew she was in trouble. Miss Marple leaned back, her knitting needles clicking softly as she resumed her work. The trap had worked. Tom's confession had laid bare the truth of the Colonel's death, but Evelyn's silence was still a thread to be pulled, and Clara's whereabouts were a mystery to be solved. The sapphire, the needle, the locket, they were all keys, unlocking a past of betrayal and revenge. She opened her notebook later, in the quiet of her cottage, and wrote, "Tom confesses Clara poisoned Colonel Dane, meant to sicken, not kill." Clara fled to Tom's sisters, driven by guilt over Sapphire's discovery. Evelyn sought Sapphire, claims no knowledge of Needle or Clara's flight. Colonel's blackmail of Lillian tied to Sapphire. Find Clara, question Evelyn further on mother's lover. She closed the notebook, her eyes fixed on the fire. The village was settling into dusk, its lights glowing softly through the mist. Miss Marple's mind was alive with the pattern taking shape of Clara's crime, Evelyn's quest, Lillian's legacy. Tomorrow she would seek Clara, and perhaps confront Evelyn with the locket's photograph. For now, she let the fire's warmth ease her, her thoughts as intricate as the stitches in her knitting. In St. Mary Mead, secrets were like shadows, and Miss Marple was ready to bring them into the light. Chapter 13. The confession. The evening draped St. Mary Mead in a velvet hush, the village lights winking like stars through the gathering mist. Miss Jane Marple sat by her fire, the sapphire and locket resting on the table beside her knitting. Their silent presence a reminder of the tangled secrets of Greystone Hall. Tom's confession at the tea gathering had unravelled a crucial thread. Clara, the quiet maid, had poisoned Colonel Dane, intending only to sicken him, but inadvertently, causing his death. Her flight, prompted by the discovery of the sapphire and the bent knitting needle, was driven by guilt and fear of exposure. Evelyn Carter's revelation as Lillian Marsh's daughter, seeking the sapphire to reclaim her mother's legacy, had added another layer, but her guarded silence suggested more to her story. Miss Marple's mind, as sharp as ever, was piecing together the final threads, and she knew that Evelyn's reticence held the key to the mystery's heart. A second gathering at Greystone Hall, she decided, would coax the truth from her lips. She telephoned Elspeth Dane, her voice calm and reassuring, proposing another tea the following afternoon to tie up loose ends about Clara. Elspeth, still shaken by Tom's revelation, agreed, her voice trembling with the strain of recent events. Miss Marple slipped the sapphire locket and Clara's torn note into her handbag, donned her coat and hat, a sturdy felt one with a modest ribbon, and prepared for the day ahead. The village was quiet as she set out, its lanes slick with evening dew, the air heavy with the scent of wet grass and wood smoke. Greystone Hall loomed at the end of the gravel drive, its stone facade sombre under a sky of deepening grey. Elspeth greeted her at the door, her face pale and her hands clutching a crumpled handkerchief. "Jane, I can hardly bear it," she said, her voice breaking. "Clara poisoning Georget's too dreadful to believe. And Evelyn's been so strange, pacing the house at all hours. I don't know what to make of her anymore." She led Miss Marple to the drawing room, where the fire burned low, casting flickering shadows on the faded wallpaper. Evelyn was already there, seated by the window, her elegant dress at odds with the tension in her posture. Tom entered moments later, his boots heavy on the floorboards, his face shadowed by his cap. He stood near the door, as he had before, his hands clasped behind him, his eyes wary. Mrs. Baxter brought tea, her scowl deeper than ever, muttering about no end of trouble before retreating. Miss Marple poured, her movements deliberate, and passed cups to Elspeth and Evelyn, offering one to Tom, who again declined. "I thought we might clear the air," Miss Marple began, her voice gentle but carrying a quiet authority. "Clara's absence has left us all unsettled, and Tom, you've been so kind to share what you know. But there's more to this, isn't there? The sapphire, The knitting needle, the locket, they all point to Lillian Marsh and to Colonel Dane's death. Evelyn, you've told us Lillian was your mother, wronged by the Colonel. But I wonder if there's more you haven't shared about why you came and what you hoped to find. Evelyn's teacup trembled in her hands, and she set it down, her eyes fixed on Miss Marple. I've told you everything, she said, her voice low but strained. I came for the sapphire, to reclaim what my mother hid. She was driven out, Miss Marple, by lies and blackmail. I wanted justice for her, nothing more. Miss Marple reached into her handbag and produced the locket, opening it to reveal Lillian's photograph. This was your mother's, wasn't it? She asked, her tone soft but probing. Inscribed forever, a lover's promise. But the letter we found, asking her to meet at midnight by the Oak, wasn't just about love, was it? It was about the burglary, the sapphire brooch. And Colonel Dane knew, didn't he? He blackmailed her, as you said, but perhaps there's more to his death than Clara's poison. Evelyn's face paled, and her hands clenched in her lap. What are you suggesting, Miss Marple? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I wasn't here when the Colonel died. I only wanted what was hers. Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes as sharp as the needle she now placed on the table beside the locket and sapphire. I believe you, Evelyn, but I think you came for more than the sapphire. You came for the truth about your mother, about the man who betrayed her, about the Colonel who ruined her. Clara's note said, the needle made it not safe. Why would a needle frighten her so, unless it pointed to something more than the sapphire? The room was silent, the fire's crackle the only sound. Elspeth's eyes were wide, her handkerchief pressed to her lips. Tom shifted, his boots scuffing the floor, his gaze fixed on Evelyn. She took a deep breath, her shoulders sagging as though a weight had been lifted. Dor added, You're right, she said at last, her voice breaking. I didn't come just for the sapphire. I came to find out what happened to my mother, and to make the Danes pay for what they did to her. The Colonel wasn't just a blackmailer. He was the man in the letter, the soldier who promised to marry her. He was my father, Miss Marple, and he abandoned her when she was pregnant with me. She hid the sapphire to escape him, but he found out and drove her away. I wanted to confront Elspeth, to make her see the pain her husband caused, but I didn't know about Clara or the poison. Elspeth gasped, her face crumpling. George, your father. Oh, Evelyn, I had no idea. He never spoke of it, never hinted. Her voice trailed off, and she buried her face in her handkerchief, her shoulders shaking. Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of quiet understanding, though her mind was racing. Evelyn's confession tied the Colonel to Lillian's betrayal, but Clara's role in the needle's significance remained unclear. And the needle, she asked gently, did you know it was used to pry open the compartment where the sapphire was hidden? Evelyn shook her head, her eyes glistening. I didn't know about the needle until you found it. I thought the sapphire was in the trunk, with my mother's things. I searched the attic, but I found nothing until you showed me the locket. It was hers, Miss Marple, the only thing she kept from him. I wanted it, and the sapphire, to prove she wasn't a thief. Tom spoke then, his voice rough but steady. Clara knew about the needle, he said. She found it and the sapphire while cleaning. She told me it wasn't just the jewel that scared hurt was what it meant. She said the Colonel had been poking around the attic before he died, like he was looking for something, she thought. He knew about the sapphire, and when she poisoned him, she was afraid he'd tell someone. When the needle turned up, She thought it was all coming back to haunt her. Miss Marple leaned back, her knitting needles clicking softly as she resumed her work. The pieces were falling into place. Lillian's betrayal by Colonel Dane, Clara's desperate act of poison, Evelyn's quest for justice. The needle had been the key, used by Lillian to hide the sapphire, and its discovery had unraveled Clara's guilt. But one question remained: where was Clara now? She turned to Tom. "You said Clara went to your sister's, Tom. Can you tell us where that is? We need to find her, to hear her side of this." Tom hesitated, his eyes flicking to Evelyn, then back to Miss Marple. "She's in Lower Mead, at my sister's cottage. I'll take you there, if you want. She's scared, Miss Marple, but she'll talk to you." Miss Marple nodded, her smile reassuring. "Thank you, Tom. We'll go tomorrow, and put this matter to rest." She rose, gathering the locket, sapphire, and needle, and promised Elspeth to return with news. As she stepped into the evening, the mist curling around her, she felt the weight of the truth settling into place. Back in her cottage, she opened her notebook and wrote, "Evelyn confesses Colonel Dane was Lillian's lover, her father blackmailed. Lillian, over sapphire, drove her away. Clara poisoned Colonel, fearing his knowledge of sapphire. Needle used by Lillian to hide gem. Clara at Tom's sister's in Lower Mead, seek her tomorrow. Evelyn sought justice, not just sapphire." She closed the notebook, her eyes fixed on the fire. The village was silent, its lights glowing softly through the mist. Miss Marple's mind was alive with the pattern now clear. Lillian's tragedy, Clara's guilt, Evelyn's revenge. Tomorrow she would find Clara, and the final thread would be tied. For now, she let the fire's warmth ease her, her thoughts as intricate as the stitches in her knitting. In St. Mary Mead, secrets were like shadows, but Miss Marple had brought them into the light. Chapter 14. The quiet resolution. The dawn broke over St. Mary Mead with a gentle clarity, the mist lifting to reveal a sky of pale blue that promised a crisp, clear day. Miss Jane Marple sat at her breakfast table, her tea steaming softly as she contemplated the revelations of the previous evening. Evelyn Carter's confession that Colonel Dane was her father, the man who betrayed her mother. Lillian Marsh had tied the sapphire, the locket, and the knitting needle to a tale of love and blackmail. Clara's poisoning of the Colonel, meant to sicken rather than kill, had been exposed by Tom's reluctant admission, and her flight to his sister's cottage in Lower Mead was the final thread to be followed. Miss Marple's mind, as sharp as the bent needle that had unlocked this mystery, was ready to bring the story to its close. She resolved to find Clara today, to hear her confession and lay the ghosts of Greystone Hall to rest. She donned her coat and had her sturdy felt one, with a single feather, chosen for its practicality, and slipped the sapphire, locket, and Clara's torn note into her handbag. The village was waking as she set out, its lanes alive with the chatter of sparrows and the clink of milk bottles. The air was fresh, carrying the scent of damp earth and fading roses, and Miss Marple's steps were brisk as she made her way to the Blue Boar, where Tom had agreed to meet her. He was waiting by the pub's gate, his cap pulled low and his hands thrust into his pockets, his face a mix of resignation and relief. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said, his voice gruff but steady. "I'll take you to Clara. She's at my sister's, like I said. She's scared, but she'll talk to you." He gestured to a battered bicycle leaning against the wall, offering to wheel it alongside her as they walked to Lower Mead, a small hamlet a mile beyond the village. The journey was quiet, the countryside unfolding in a patchwork of fields and hedgerows. Miss Marple noted Tom's silence, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, and sensed the weight of his loyalty to Clara. "You've been a good friend to her, Tom," she said gently. "It can't have been easy, carrying her secret all these years." Tom's shoulders stiffened, but he nodded. "She didn't mean to kill him, Miss Marple. She just wanted him to stop using her, like he used Maggie before her. When she found that sapphire, it brought it all back, like the past was coming for her." His voice was low, rough with emotion, and Miss Marple saw the pain in his eyes. The burden of a man who had protected someone at great cost. Lower Mead was a cluster of cottages nestled in a hollow, their thatched roofs glistening with dew. Tom led her to a small house with a neat garden, where a woman, his sister, Mary, greeted them at the door. Her face was kind but wary, and she ushered them inside without a word. Clara sat by the kitchen fire, her hands clasped tightly, her face pale and drawn. Her eyes widened as she saw Miss Marple, and she stood, her voice trembling. "Miss Marple, I didn't mean for it to happen. I swear I didn't." Miss Marple settled into a chair, her handbag on her lap, her expression one of quiet compassion. "I believe you, Clara," she said softly, "but I need to hear it from you. Tell me about the Colonel and the needle and why you ran." Clara took a shuddering breath, her hands twisting in her apron. "It was 5 years ago," she began. "The Colonel. He was kind at first, said I was special. But then he turned cold, said I'd lose my place if I didn't do what he wanted. I hated him, Miss Marple, but I was scared. I put foxglove in his tea, just a little, to make him ill, to make him stop. But he drank too much, and he died." Her voice broke, and she buried her face in her hands. "I didn't mean to kill him. I was so afraid, and when I found that needle in the attic, and then the sapphire, I thought it was a sign someone knew. Someone was coming for me." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes gentle but probing. "And the needle, Clara. How did you find it?" "It was by that trunk," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was sweeping, and it glinted in the light. I didn't think much of it, but then I found a loose board and the sapphire inside. I knew it was from the old burglary. Mrs. Baxter used to talk about it, how the governess was blamed. I thought if anyone found it, they'd think I stole it, or worse, they'd ask about the Colonel. I couldn't stay, Miss Marple. I had to run." Miss Marple reached into her handbag and produced the sapphire, its blue depths catching the firelight. "This was hidden by Lillian Marsh," she said. "She took it to escape the Colonel, who was her lover, and later blackmailed her. You didn't steal it, Clara, but your fear was understandable. The needle was her tool, used to hide the gem. You've carried enough guilt. Will you come back to Greystone Hall to face this with us?" Clara hesitated, her eyes darting to Tom, who gave her a reassuring nod. "I'll come," she said at last, her voice small but resolute. "I want it to be over." The return to St. Mary Mead was quiet, Clara walking between Miss Marple and Tom, her head bowed. At Greystone Hall, Elspeth was waiting, her face a mix of relief and sorrow as she saw Clara. Evelyn was there too, her expression guarded but softened by the sight of the maid. Miss Marple gathered them in the drawing room, the sapphire locket and needle on the table before her, their presence a silent testament to the truth. "Clara has told me everything," Miss Marple said, her voice calm but carrying a quiet authority. "She poisoned Colonel Dane, not to kill, but to stop his cruelty. It was a mistake, and she's carried the guilt ever since. The sapphire, hidden by Lillian Marsh, was a relic of her own escape from the Colonel's betrayal. Evelyn, you sought justice for your mother, and Clara, you sought peace from your fear. The needle brought it all to light, as small things often do. Elspeth's eyes filled with tears, but she reached for Clara's hand. I didn't know Clara, she said. George was not the man I thought. I forgive you, Evelyn nodded, her face softening further. I only wanted my mother's name cleared, she said. The sapphire is hers, but I'll leave it with you, Elspeth, as it belongs to the hall. Miss Marple smiled, her work nearly done. She advised Clara to speak to the vicar, to ease her conscience, and suggested the sapphire be returned to the Haverford family if they could be found. As she left Greystone Hall, the sun was high, casting a warm glow over the manor. The village was alive with its usual rhythm, and Miss Marple felt a quiet satisfaction. The ghosts of the past had been laid to rest, their secrets unravelled by a single bent needle. Back in her cottage, she settled by the fire, her knitting needles resuming their steady rhythm. She opened her notebook and wrote, Clara confesses to poisoning Colonel Dane, unintended death. Sapphire hidden by Lillian Marsh, reclaimed by Evelyn, her daughter. Needle used to hide gem, uncovered truth. Clara returns, forgiven by Elspeth. Sapphire to be returned to Haverford's case closed. She closed the notebook, her eyes fixed on the flames. The village of St. Mary Mead was quiet, its lights glowing softly as evening fell. Miss Marple's mind was at ease, the tapestry of secrets now complete. The knitting needle, the locket, the sapphire, they had told their story, and she had listened. For now, she let the fire's warmth soothe her, her thoughts as intricate as the stitches in her knitting. In St. Mary Mead, the past was never truly silent, but Miss Marple had brought its whispers to rest.